Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We had, we had to put Matt on like copy duty or something. So appreciate everyone showing up this afternoon. We have a full agenda, but before we get started, just a couple of quick topics. First off, I wanted to, to make sure that we sent some well wishes to Commissioner Scott. I think he is undergoing some surgery, nothing, hopefully nothing major, but we certainly want to keep him in our thoughts as he goes through that. I think it was a vacation accident that went awry. So we send out good thoughts in that direction. I also wanted to let the commissioners know that we are also working on some of the follow-up from the last meeting. So that is a to-do item that we will get back to folks, hopefully by the close of the week. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then on a technical front, and this is for people like myself who need these kinds of things at this ripe age, the Zoom is going to make the presentations smaller. They are on the website, so people will have them available, but they are not able, because of a technical issue, are not able to be Zoomed along with the current presentation. So we would ask folks to go to the website and pull those down if they need to refer to them. So they are available. And I think I covered all of our initial topics. We have a full agenda, lots of good things to talk about today. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. And with that, I think I will toss it to Steve and we can kick it off. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. My name is Steve McCulloch with the Department of Legislative Services. To my left is Caleb Weiss, who is with MDOT. I'm here today to present the results of the survey that many of you received the link for. Just as background, MDOT is seeking to develop an updated project prioritization process in order to get some feedback. They developed a survey and sent it out. So I'll be presenting the survey results. If there are any questions on the survey itself, that's what Caleb is sitting here to provide. So as I said, MDOT sent out a link for this survey. They received 33 responses back. The responses had some self-identified affiliations, including 12 identifying as county agency personnel, 4 city metropolitan planning officer organizations, 4, and then there were 13 in the other category. Now, the intent of the survey was to elicit feedback. There was not a lot of lead time. And so it was neither designed nor conducted in a manner which really allows inferences to be drawn from the responses that were received to larger populations. And because of that, the following summaries will be kind of on the total response population and not trying to divide it up into any subgroups. In the first part of the survey asked about the current consolidated transportation program project selection process, and the majority of the respondents for the 2 graphs shown on this page had at least some knowledge of the process, but only a small number of respondents indicated they understood why projects were or were not funded. Continuing with the CTP current process, only a small number of the respondents believe that the CTP process is unbiased and transparent. The most respondents were unsure or don't believe the CTP process project selection is data driven, and just over a third of the respondents believe that the CTP process does, though, in factor in state goals. In looking at the agency input on the process and the feedback received on that process, less than a third of the respondents indicated a belief that their agency's input was considered in project selection. A slightly smaller number of those respondents did report receiving feedback on their agency input. Turning now to the Chapter 30 of 2017 scoring model that is part of the, that is in statute and is required to be applied to a subset of projects in the CTP. Majority of the respondents indicated at least some familiarity with the Chapter 30 scoring process, but only a small minority believe that the scores are reflected in project selection for inclusion in the CTP. Looking now at future, series of questions asked on the future prioritization process, and the slide on PDF page 13 showed that the respondents, a majority of all the respondents thought that all of the items that were listed in the survey as possible items for inclusion in a future process were actually important. So the items listed by MDOT do show that people do have agreement on those are the types of items that should be included. And then finally, the capacity expansion and planning study projects were identified by a majority of the respondents as needing to go through a prioritization process for most modes, except for the exception being motor vehicle administration, which has a much smaller capital program. It was slightly less than a majority believe those two items needed to go through a prioritization process. And then in conclusion, just again, keeping in mind that the small sample, but overall, this current CTP process in Chapter 30, scoring systems were not viewed in a positive light. Most of the respondents agreed that the items identified for a future prioritization process were important to be included. And as I indicated at the last slide, capacity expansion and planning studies were the two kind of types of projects that the majority of the respondents thought should go through a future prioritization process. So that concludes my presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Caleb, did you have anything you wanted to add to the conversation?
No, that's just
Okay.
to answer any questions that are here.
Okay. I mean, I think generally speaking, you know, in talking with, you know, with the department and with the staff folks, clearly the sample size is something that we would love to improve upon for the purposes of having a better baseline of where we are in this discussion. So certainly we'll send out another encouragement that, you know, that we get additional participation from folks on that with their insights, because I think that will be helpful as we continue the conversation. So are there any questions from the commissioners to the panel? Commissioner Winstead.
Caleb, only 33 surveys were received, correct? I don't know, in the case of municipalities, do you know how many of the 4 were large cities or small municipalities? Was there any sense of, respondents were just the large cities or what?
I don't have the exact breakdown at this
Okay.
moment. I'm sure that's data that we have the data, so I can get back to you on that one.
Okay, Frank, to your point, I think, you know, the populace here, the audience is really insufficient, you know, to conclude, you know, that we've gotten feedback, number one. Number two, I'm just wondering whether, you know, all of the economic development agencies on county and city level were reached out to, whether the chambers were reached out to, and whether organizations like that had, you know, lead individuals like the executive director, MML, forwarding the resume to get more attention to it. I agree with you that I think we haven't had exactly what we need here.
Yeah, I think Commissioner, there will be an opportunity to work with staff and talk about additional folks that we might think would be useful in terms of getting additional feedback to the commission. So you have a fuller picture of that. So we'll take that back. Thank you. I appreciate that. Commissioner Kirchville, you had a question?
Well, I was just going to say, is it correct that when you looked at, I saw an email that came to our MPO director and it looked like 200 of those, 245 were the General Assembly. And then just 45 were the local and regional people. Is that correct?
I believe it's some, I don't have the exact numbers.
Because
Off the top of my-
our other commissioner just said, you know, I think the types of places that we send it out, we had 2 county staffers that run all of our road capital planning that didn't receive it, that you know, they had to go kind of look back for it. I had forwarded them some stuff. So if we're going to continue that, it's who we're going to mine it to and who we're going to send it out to is probably important.
Yep, certainly.
Thank you. Commissioner Sakata?
I guess, 2 questions. What falls under the other category?
In terms of stakeholders that this was sent out to. That was like locally operated transit agencies, there's WMATA and others, stakeholders like that. Basically, anything that kind of did not fall into one of the other main categories.
And second question is, can there be a question added for the open-ended response instead of important or not important elements to prioritize, asking what other elements to consider, or would you consider?
Certainly, yeah, we can take a look at that and see what we can do.
Commissioner Flora?
Just real quick. So we had 33 responses. What was your total distribution total? How many did it go to?
We certainly have the total data, and I can get back to you on that one.
Yeah, I was just looking at a percentage basis, but and when you come back with more robust conclusions, will we be able to sort it by stakeholder type then? Because these 4 breakdowns don't really give us enough of a sorting of stakeholder type, I don't think, because depending on who and how many that outreach is, and then that breakdown is really going to skew the outcomes quite a bit. So I'd be interested in that when you come back with more robust, hopefully response.
Okay, yeah, we can look into that and get back to you.
Commissioner?
It's the survey sent to non-governmental organizations. I apologize if you said this, but can you share how the survey was distributed or put out publicly?
The survey was distributed to a number of different stakeholder types that were identified by MDOT in hopes of kind of providing information to the commission as it continues its work. They broadly fell into the categories that were defined and on the slide in the slide deck, and we can provide additional information and on the exact number of individuals that it was sent to.
Okay, I'm just curious if I missed it or if it was not sent to the commission members itself.
I can get back to you on that one.
Okay, because I don't want to criticize if it turns out I just lost it in my spam folder, but I did want to flag that it would be good to either know if it was sent to non-governmental organizations and if the scope is trying to explore how the process is functioning for the participation of residents and non-governmental organizations, or if that's not within the scope. If it is within the scope, then I would say that I don't think I got it, and I'm not sure. I'd be really interested in who it reached.
Okay, I can look into that one for you.
I appreciate all that feedback. We will certainly, continue to work on this. I do believe, as a baseline, this is a starting point. So we definitely have additional work that needs to be done on this front, and certainly we'll work with all of the commissioners to make sure we cover the folks that, that may have somehow inadvertently gotten left off if they were. Okay, great. Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. I think up next we have our friends at Mako. Mr. Sanderson, do you want to bring your team?
Oh, okay.
Great.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, fellow members of the commission. As president of the Maryland Association of Counties, I'm honored to be here with you wearing those 2 hats and to introduce our illustrious panel to share feedback from Maryland counties with the commission. Mako represents Maryland's 23 counties and Baltimore City, and we advocate on their behalf to the Maryland General Assembly and state government. We greatly appreciate the invitation to join the Train Commission today and to share feedback on transportation revenue and infrastructure issues from the county perspective. Each year, counties share a transportation priority letter with MDOT to highlight our local priorities. As you will hear from our panel today, we value this opportunity to provide feedback and collaborate on our shared transportation goals. In Howard County, this partnership has helped us advance critical transportation, safety, and capacity projects that our shared constituents benefit from and appreciate. As we evaluate funding needs and project prioritization decisions, I want to underscore the importance of local input and consideration during the development of the Consolidated Transportation Program. Maryland's counties have expressed a collective interest to deepen our engagement with MDOT throughout the annual CTP process. This process would benefit from more clarity and understanding of how transportation projects are prioritized and funded by the state, especially as it pertains to receiving feedback from local requests. Additional, local governments are feeling similar funding pressures that our state partners are experiencing for transportation projects. Since local share of highway user revenues dramatically were cut in 2009, Maryland's counties have locally funded an oversized share of transportation maintenance, repair, and capacity projects in our counties. We look forward to working with the state on funding partnerships into the future. And now, I'm happy to introduce our MACO panel, which will dive deeper into our priorities. We are joined by Michael Sanderson, our Executive Director of MACO, Sierra Wigfield, who joins us from Garrett County Government, and Bruce Gartner, my administrator of the Howard County Office of Transportation. I'm now going to turn it over to Michael to kick it off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and Commission members. Pleasure to be before you. MACO submitted a letter that I think is in your materials today. I'll spare you the rehashing and recitation of all the points therein, but I want to take just a moment to leave two quick leave-behinds. First of them is on the submission of local priorities. I've gathered that the commission has some interest in standardizing or more uniform submissions and that sort of thing. I would just offer one bit of caution in that pursuit, which may itself be a noble pursuit, and that is, please don't construct a uniform structure that is so technically burdensome that it might leave meritorious projects behind. As you heard from MACO President and County Executive, the counties right now are in a tough spot with local transportation funding. Maryland model doesn't have any local transportation revenues. There are some states that have a local gas tax or an add-on for the license plate. Maryland has no such thing. We're entirely beholden to the state for transportation revenues. And by the work of the General Assembly, we're making our way back from the cuts in 2009. There's a multi-year plan to get Baltimore City back to full funding, to get the municipal governments back to full funding. But even the path we're on only gets the counties back a third of the way to where they used to be. That's just nominal dollars, not even like purchasing power. So as a practical matter, the counties are backfilling, and the capacity issue is a real one. I'll also offer one of the other topics that your staff, in giving some guidance on the presentation for today, the question with Chapter 30 and the scoring mechanism. As a former foot soldier in the legislative debate that ended up leading to Chapter 30, I'll just offer one general point of view, and that is, if the first foible into the scoring system leaves us with a cautionary note, it's probably that using one scoring system for every region and every mode and every type of project might be more than you can, maybe biting off more than you can chew with a scoring system. You're apparently going to hear from other states that use a model like this, in Virginia and other states and so forth. And there might be merit to a scoring system, to more transparency, what's on and what's off the list and so forth. But Virginia does this by regions. Most states don't have a multi-mode intermixed funding source like our Consolidated Transportation Trust Fund. We may not be apples to apples with all of the other states that have explored this area. And I think it's probably a worthwhile North Star to keep in mind as you consider those things. So the issues in our letter, I think, are hopeful, but I think you'll hear more value from my fellow panelists, and I want to turn the microphone over to them.
No. Hi, Sierra Wakefield with Garrett County. Prior to being with Garrett County for the past 2 years, I was with Allegheny County for 15, and of 12 of those years were spent writing the county's priority letter. And I was really proud of the elected officials coming together and prioritizing our projects. The way I've always kind of viewed it is we went based on like top priorities all the way down, just a list of numbers, and mixed in safety projects with transit projects and bike and ped projects, and just to show to the state that, you know, this is the top one regardless of funding mechanisms. It is to get that cooperation is sometimes a challenge, but generally we pulled off, and I'd have all the mayors and delegates and commissioners sign the letter. And there's been times where I'd see progress on those projects, but other times like my letter would be the same for like spans of years. I guess I would turn it in, and then the tour would come around, and then I'd always take notes of tour what the elected officials said. Sometimes they were kind of reactionary to whatever was happening. And oftentimes they were incorporated in the priority letter, like and that following spring. So we just try to keep it up to date. And I think it's nice. It's almost like a living document for us in terms of transportation planning. We can always refer to our priority letters. It gets updated on an annual basis. And yeah, we can kind of, because it is a flexible format, I can fit it for a rural county, but it also works for the more urban jurisdictions. And also the level of effort in terms of staffing, like I would make the maps for it, and I'd fill out the questionnaires, and you know, and on top of my other job duties. So I appreciate Mako being aware of, like, you know, the level of effort it takes. But it would be nice to get some more feedback from MDOT in terms of when we get in the letter, I usually get a reply saying thanks for the letter, but then I don't really hear too much. We do submit projects for like bikeways and TAP grants, and, you know, knowing that those projects are listed in the priority letter does help our chances in that kind of funding. So that is helpful. And also I've always coordinated with my local MDOT and SHA staff. So I can kind of get an idea of like where we are on the next phase of this project, or by the time I write the letter, should I ask for, you finish the planning part, we're going to ask for design, and keep my projects updated. Lastly, I haven't really had, because all of our projects usually over $5 million that meet like the Chapter 30 threshold are always bridge projects. They're very rarely like transit or other infrastructure related. I haven't had to use them in my jurisdictions. And yeah, so it's, yes, be aware of like the level of effort, but I would like more transparency in the process. Yes, you can go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Bruce Gartner, and I serve as the administrator for County Executive Ball. For about half the room, I think you know me from my previous career. I did spend quite a few years at MDOT, ended up as an agency head there. So I've been on both sides of the annual tour process and bring that perspective today as well. I'm going to say a lot of the same things that have already been said. I would note that even though we are, one of the big 8 counties, we still have a relatively small planning staff to deal with our local road and transit issues. We do manage the transit system. And we also have to run the priority process out of our office. Just by way of example of what we've done in Howard County, somewhat similar to Garrett, but it has been a survey, a process for us that we start in January leading up to the April letter. We'll do an open house. We'll get a lot of good feedback from the citizens. It will vary from year to year if there's some hot topic that can really dominate what can go into a letter sometimes. So that's been a very interesting process. I saw that on the state side as well. But by and large, it's that process, because it's been flexible. The takeaway is that it's really helped get our elected officials, and we both have the local, state, and elected officials sign our letters. Some counties, I don't believe, have a local or delegation and a county executive. So we do all three in Howard County. And that flexible process is allowed to us to basically satisfy those needs within our state elected officials. Similarly, though, it's often hard to figure out exactly how to write a letter to do these things, and maybe a letter shouldn't decide them. In Howard County, we've prioritized our corridors. One of our prime corridors, US 1, is a very much a safety type project. US 29 is a transit, more of a transit focused project, and I-70 is more of a congestion project, a highway congestion project that serves many counties, not just Howard County, but those to the west of us and people going into Baltimore. So that flexibility has been helpful. But again, depends on the year, it depends on the administration. It would be good to know going into that if there is something happening more specifically with the flavor of that. This year, we had the opportunity, the county executive meeting with the secretary early in the process. Hopefully the secretary was able to do that with many, and just getting that early flavor of where we were going and gearing up for things prior to the CTP was helpful. But when it comes time to look at that draft program, it's like, the tour meetings, you can only say so much. The meetings with district engineers are good, but a lot of times the feedback, I think, needs to flow through multiple levels of MDOT, having been there. I know that. And any direct feedback that can come through those multiple levels and be on a consistent basis for projects would be helpful. By way of an example of where we have been successful in kind of the MDOT process, I don't want to advocate for discretionary grants for everything, because talk about time intensive, and the federal government is doing that. But in the TAP grant process for bikeways projects and everything, we kind of know our regional allocation, and we know what the factors are. We know how much we need to contribute to be competitive. That's worked fairly well for us. Not that I want to, we would want to exactly replicate that, but that would be helpful. So in conclusion, I just like to say that this last CTP, there were a number of changes in it. We appreciate some of the direction that we're going, but we're still looking for more feedback from you all at MDOT on what it really means for us. We would really desire those of us in the metropolitan regions more collaboration at the MPO level, so we get a better sense of that. That staff at the MPO level is a great force magnifier to us, and we really rely on them. So focusing on that process would be helpful as well. So as Michael said, one size doesn't fit all for all the counties. And it's just going to be hard. We look forward to working with you, and particularly hearing from my colleagues that are still at MDOT on what they think would be beneficial to the process, because they've had to live with this through multiple types of federal and state programs and state direction. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you all. It's very helpful. I mean, I definitely agree with some of the comments that were made, especially the one size fits all. Apples to apples are always very hard to come by these days. I think we do a good job of trying to scan the environment and understand what's out there. But whatever product that's brought forward is definitely going to be very reflexive of what the state specific. So I think, and I also, to Sierra's point, I think that, the after action of these and the discussions in terms of follow on is really also something very critical, and something, having been in a prior position within MDOT, I think, being able to talk to the counties about, what was maybe not there that we're looking for is something that we can definitely, work harder to do a better job on. So I appreciate the panel's comments. I open the floor to the commissioners for any questions. Wow. Go ahead, Commissioner Sakata.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time, by the way. If we're considering different scoring scales, criteria, and I appreciate that, for different regions in the state, can you give an example of what this may look like? How would the scoring criteria be different from Baltimore to Washington to Garrett even?
Since I opened that door, I'll try and take a swing at this. I think you're probably beyond my technical depth on the subject. I heard this input. We got a solicitation to appear before you all and some time to do so. We got input from a number of jurisdictions, and this flavor was one of the most common feedback items that came to us from our member counties, that apples to apples was a problem, even with the contemplated scoring system and the piece of it that remains now is chapter 30. So I can't tell you, here's chapter and verse, here's the state that's got it perfect. Virginia does this broken out by regions. That might be a starting point, but it may be that different modes need a different analysis. But that seemed to be the most friction the last time this was a legislative debate of, well, if you apply this column of numbers to every single project, these will all win, these will all lose, and that seemed somehow not reflecting of the statewide needs. So,
May I
Sure, please.
expand upon that? I guess concern from, counties with like lower populations and lower traffic counts and all that. So if we would have those items as, in some sort of proportion for our area, I think that would make more sense because, what we see is just a lower count in general versus in the other counties. So something along those lines, and maybe working with like a regional sense in order to develop those thresholds would be helpful.
Thank you for that. I think
That, and also our budgets are a little smaller. So also we're probably going to ask for less if we have to match, 10-20%. So as well.
and I appreciate your candor. I think Maryland is blessed with the geographically diverse with many coastlines we have with, they're unlike other states. So I think we can all appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Flora.
Yeah, I wanted to just pick up on region. So to what extent are the counties open to coming together as regions for prioritization? Because it seems that dividing this county by county is very difficult in transportation planning. And so is there a sense that the counties are open to sort of really coming together as regions, separate from, of course, MPOs, but more from that local perspective to create more locally based regional prioritization? Just curious.
I'll offer one quick general observation. This isn't something we specifically asked members for to give input on for today's presentation. I will say one thing you pick up by engaging at the county by county level is the state tasked county governments with a comprehensive land use plan at the county level, not the tri-county level, not the regional level, but at the individual county level. So one of the merits of having a county-based system is you avoid, let's make a capacity improvement over here, which will inevitably drive growth right beyond it. And if that's a place where we don't have a plan for water and sewer and the infrastructure to manage that growth, you're out of step. So there's some of that you can accomplish with a regional planning organization and with regional transportation planning, but engaging at the county level gets you more than transportation. And I think there's merit in that. So maybe a yes, and if we're playing the improv game.
Well, you sort of opened the door to where I was going. I'm Secretary of Planning. And so in terms of comp plans at the county level, and to what extent are those even really the way we have to be looking at things in the future? Just kind of food for thought, because I think these things are all interconnected. It's a thread, right? Economic development, all of these things interconnect. And if we are just focused on that county boundary, we're losing the opportunity for that. I think more of a regional, because by region, we do have a lot of similarities usually. That maybe it goes beyond just how we think about transportation to that broader issues of the comp plan.
Could be a lively forum at a Mako
I bet it
conference
would. I would
someday.
love to facilitate that. Thank you.
And if I may just jump in briefly to address both of the last two questions, to similarly riff off of what Michael was saying about the yes and. I think if we look at these two issues almost as three different levels, that's what we're asking. At the statewide level, guidance on what is the vision, what are the priorities moving forward, and a collaboration to say right now we're going to try to primarily focus on roadway safety or moving people along efficiently or whatever the various issues are. And then I think there is an opportunity for regional impacts. You know, Bruce talked a little bit about some of our priorities, 29, Route 1, 70. These are all areas that go throughout multiple jurisdictions. And then, of course, a county by county, just like Mike was indicating, and as you were, because we do our general plans, our comprehensive plans, and with budgeting. So I think what we're really hoping as MACO is to really have a collaborative conversation as partners and understand what are the rules, what are the issues that are being weighed, as was indicated earlier by Sierra. We write these letters, we talk to our constituents, and sometimes it's unclear what are the specific factors that were considered and how were they weighed. And that's what I think is the bigger, broader conversation that MACO would like to have.
Commissioner Hershey.
Thank you. And I was just, County Executive Ball said exactly the same things I wanted to talk about as well. Brought up by Secretary Flora, that when you look at these from a multi-county or regional perspective, especially from my perspective on the Eastern Shore, you know, sometimes it is difficult to get all the counties on board with one specific issue, although it's a regional issue. And for many years, we were advocating to get Route 404 dualized. It was always Caroline County's priority, but not necessarily Queen Anne's or Talbot's, because such a small portion was there. But I also think in terms of, and again, because these letters have to be drafted, and again, I think you could probably look at, you know, each letter and see 24 different styles of how these letters got put together. But it's also very competitive. And I think sometimes you see counties not wanting to put that big, huge project up on top for fear that they're not getting the smaller projects that are very important to them as well, too. And, you know, the other one we've seen, again, with regional perspective, obviously, you know, what are we going to do with the Chesapeake Bay Bridge and an additional crossing? That really didn't get as much momentum as we would have liked to seen on the Eastern Shore until Anne Arundel County came over and said, you know what, we're okay with this too, when they recognize the amount of congestion. So I just think that we have to find a way that gives these counties the opportunity to look, you know, even if we do different ways regionally or different styles on how this is put together, but also how you look at regional projects and make sure that they don't necessarily have to put that on the top of their list for everybody to recognize. It's still the most important thing, or most important project that's out there.
Thank you, Senator. Commissioner Tolkien.
Is it on? I was going to turn off my mic to say this, but then I thought I will never pass up the opportunity to say something I don't get to say very often, which is I was going to say what the senator just said about the need for regional coordination. We've definitely observed that a lot of these topics are challenging for the counties to deal with individually. The Baltimore Region Transit Plan was a great example where when counties were invited to participate, we saw a lot of these issues emerging that had not emerged on the priority letters, because what typically each of them was saying is we need help to think through this, and the priority letters didn't function in that way, even if the topic was very important.
I'm not going to steal Commissioner Laria's lead into this, but I feel like this topic feels very similar to, you know, the Plan Maryland conversation that you and I were having in Minneapolis. But with that, I'll kick it to Commissioner Laria, please.
Necessarily going to go there, Mr. Chair, but please don't take this as a criticism, either of your approach or of MML's that you're about to hear. But I'm sort of hearing a lot of diagnosis and not much prescription. You know, it's sort of like, these are the issues, these are the concerns. It would be good if we got some guidance, but I'm hoping that the process, and I'm not suggesting this was your task today, which is why I'm not being critical, but I'm hoping that the process is soon going to turn to, either via the commission or MDOT or whatever, to, okay, well, give us the 15 ways it should be better. Because I said last time, that was pretty clear to me as a non-state, non-local official, that nobody likes it. And I think that's sort of being emphasized again today. You're being very polite. I appreciate that, but I think it's pretty clear. So, we just need to figure that out. And I'm hoping that there's a process, and I don't know what it's going to be exactly, whether it's a legislative process or whether it's going to come through this commission. But obviously, you all probably have all sorts of ways in which you want it to be better. And I am quite familiar from my prior experience that not every one size doesn't fit all. And that, you can't, there may not be a unified, it may not be, this is the way every county wants it identically. And, you may have to do different things. And typically the counties and municipalities may have slightly different views, et cetera. So I'm just hopeful that we can get through what I think is a due respect, relatively obvious conclusion at this point, that these are the issues, and then figure out what it is we need to do to make this process work better. Mr. Chair, thanks.
So if I may just put on my educator hat, almost like a syllabus. You go into a class, what are the goals? What are the assignments? How are the assignments weighted? What are you going to have to do? Are these individual assignments? Are these team assignments? I think having more of that set forward and then earlier conversation are some of the things that I think would be helpful. I think sometimes we hear from constituents who feel like there's this dog and pony show, but we don't know who's listening to what actually comes of it. What are the decisions already made ahead of time? I think these are some of the things that we can allay those concerns with more conversation, a clear rubric, and better understanding, like we were talking about before, at the state level, the regional level, and the local level. What are the priorities? What are the goals, and how we can work together?
Yeah. Commissioner Henninger.
Thank you. And I would say there certainly is a benefit to the syllabus model. But as a recent teaching assistant, I can say that sometimes the most helpful thing is a helping hand, and that those who are already feeling a bit behind can be a little bit scared by a long syllabus that has a lot of details of everything that needs to be included in that essay submission. So I guess my suggestion, and I would really appreciate the county representative's feedback on this. It has to do with folks that we might know from our personal lives, those being insurance adjusters, and the process by which each of us might submit a car insurance claim, a home insurance claim. The door is intentionally meant to be easy to walk through. And then after that point, there is a person that follows up with any additional questions, might ask you for photographs, additional information of that sort. It seems to me that this letter process is a relatively easy door to walk through, but insofar as there might be things that are not included in a county's letter that need to be included, there needs to be follow-up there from MDOT at the state level to say, let's figure this out and work collaboratively rather than having that laundry list up front. What would we think about that from a Garrett County perspective, let's say?
I agree with that. That sounds really good to have like some follow-ups, because sometimes we don't have a cost estimate, but I would love to look into it more and maybe get you a cost estimate if that's a piece of information that would be helpful. Or, if MDOT is seriously considering it, then I can give you a better idea, like how much we could match it or cooperate on a project, or, provide some data or, photographs, I think speak louder than words oftentimes. So yeah, in terms of follow-up and providing additional data, I used to fill out this long questionnaire with check boxes and additional essays that related to like the transportation plan. And anymore, I just make a matrix and I check the boxes as the transportation plan gets updated on the frequent on like the 5-year basis. And I don't know if that's been well received, or if that saves everybody a little bit of paperwork. It certainly saves me some paperwork, but yes, I would very much love a follow-up, and I'd be happy to provide additional information.
So maybe I should defer this to one of our elected officials to say, but maybe I have the benefit of not being an elected official, so I'll say it. And sometimes the best input we could get from an MDOT or something else is like, no. Like, we're not going to do that. It doesn't meet this. Because we get requests in at the county level to add things, whatever, and maybe not just a no, but no and why. And that happens around the margins, but maybe we just need to ask it for it more clearly. Sometimes projects that are just sitting on that letter need help getting off. MDOT did take the step this year to actually delete some projects from the program that had zero. This is again, sorry, boss, it's more of a personal observation, not a Howard County, but I think that's helpful to the process. You know, if something's not advancing, let's not continue on. And, you know, when I was at MDOT, we went through periods where we were having an increasing program and a decreasing program at the same time. Like you're literally figuring out what you can fund because federal funds are coming in and what you have to defund, and just understanding what is a no is helpful. So just add that perspective.
Thank you. Commissioner Stevens.
Yes, thank you. Two takeaways I had from Sierra's comments. One about the force multiplier effect of the MPOs, and which you've already stated, and a number of folks have reinforced the limited capacity, particularly in the rural areas and the counties that don't even have an MPO. That factor plays out in whether it's bikeways grants, whether it's road grants, whether it's bridge grants. We don't have that MPO capacity to assist an already very small staff. And so you're further disadvantaged in that way. And I'm looking forward to hearing later from the North Carolina model, which had some stratification with some things that are regional, some things that are district, some things that are statewide, which I think might be a way to go in balancing those local needs with the regional needs. But I think the other comment that you made was about the fact, and this is true on a number of lower shore letters, the same projects are put on year over year. And I would echo what you said, sir, from how, just say no. Let's not keep putting the same projects on if there's no chance that they're going to get funded. And maybe someone was told that along the way, but they continue to be in the letters. And it seems like that if we took those never going to happen projects off, we might put some could happen projects on. And so that just reinforcing what's been said about the feedback loop. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. This has been very
Thank you.
helpful. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
We will hear from MML next. Bill, you're up.
Good afternoon to the chair and members of the commission. My name is Bill Jorsch. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Research for the Maryland Municipal League. Thank you so much for the invitation to talk today. My main priority is to talk to you a little bit about a dedicated and predictable funding stream from the state and how important it is to municipalities for their transportation projects. Before I get there, I do want to echo my friends from the county's perspectives on the CTP planning process and the importance of local input. I echo what they have to say. I think it's clear that there's a desire for local input into the planning process. The fact that there's already, the local letters, as well as an element of the scoring system. And if that's not working and it's the will of the commission, I can say that we're more than happy to help get together with you all and our friends at the county to come up with some possible solutions. So that's on the table from our perspective. So, but again, my main point today is to talk to you a little bit about highway user revenues and its importance to municipal governments. I'm not here to rehash or reopen any wounds of the past, but more just to just shine a light on this portion of the CTP and it's the most direct and most directly impactful portion of the CTP to municipal governments. I'm going to give you just a couple stats to help contextualize this a little bit. Municipalities in the state collectively occupy only less than 5% of the land area, but they house 25% of the population. 9% of all lane miles are found in municipalities. 7 out of the 10 top places to visit, according to U.S. News and World Report, and 13 of the top 10 tourist attractions, according to Visit Maryland, are in incorporated municipalities. My whole point in saying this is that there's a disproportionately high amount of traffic in municipalities despite their small area. This leads to faster deterioration of their roadways and a need for a dedicated and predictable funding stream. And as the prior panel mentioned, at the current moment, there's no lever for local governments to pull on their own to get more dedicated transportation funding other than what's going into their general fund, which for municipalities is by and large just the property tax. Excuse me. The Maryland General Assembly just last year in 2022 did restore the municipal share of highway user revenues back to where it was prior to the 2009 cuts that were alluded to earlier. And we are grateful for their work on that. And I think our big ask is that as you explore new revenue streams and talk about expenditures from the Transportation Trust Fund, to just understand how vitally important this state shared revenue for transportation projects is, and to keep it at a level that's either current where it is now, or maybe even slightly higher to cover the cost of transportation projects in local governments. I can tell you that each year municipalities are required to submit a report to the MDOT articulating how they spent their HURs for the prior fiscal year. And there is an appendix at the end that they are allowed to extrapolate on projects that either were deferred due to not enough money, or in a separate column, they can put money spent from the general fund. And every year there's money coming out of the general fund for HUR eligible projects. Again, I'm not here to bang the table for more money. I'm just highlighting the importance for local governments. With that, I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you all so much for your time today.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Questions? Oh, Ola Ben. Yep, Commissioner. Sorry.
All right. So I sit, at the county level with Prince George's County. I'm curious how many municipalities directly communicate with you for their priority letters. Do you encourage them to work with the county or submit we get a couple of letters of the municipalities that are in Prince George's County, but I'm curious what is communicated from your vantage point. And does that also include Baltimore City as well at your level, or are they more so at the MACo because of how large they are?
Right. Great questions. To your first point, our messaging is to when appropriate and applicable to work with the county. I think there is a strength when the county and municipalities are in line for a priority. I think that carries a little more weight. However, I do think that there are instances where there may be a municipal priority that does not align with the county priority, and the ability for a municipality to still submit a priority letter or make that known to MDOT, I think is still important, because while there are many instances where the county and municipal interests align in terms of a regional project, it's not always the case. But our message is to work with the counties as when it's applicable. And for the city, they're members of both organizations, and it's. Yeah, I don't know exactly how to answer. They're part of our communication platform. They're certainly receiving our messages. And so I guess it's a little bit from both buckets.
So to clarify, so during the CTP tour for MDOT, municipalities will send letters to you, or you'll reach out to the cities and say, hey, we're in that season, and they submit letters to you, and then you submit that to MDOT?
Sure. It's more like the latter. We don't receive the letters ahead of time unless they're looking for specific input from MML. We do alert them to the priority letter process when that's going on, when it's due, that whole part, when the roadshow is coming to their county. We're pushing that information to our members. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second half of your question.
And then so you reach out to the municipalities, right, before, and then they submit letters to you and MDOT. Yes,
we're generally not copied on the final product.
Okay.
But
so you don't see that at your
correct.
level.
We see it after the fact, after it's been submitted to MDOT and it's published on their website. Generally.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Laria.
Thank you. Two quick things. For MML, the counties obviously are generally larger than the municipalities. Does MML provide any sort of advice, counsel, feedback? I mean, I would think that in some instances, some municipalities would be like, we don't have the staff, we don't have the infrastructure to do this. So from what you just said, it sounds like there isn't much interaction. And I wonder if MML ever provides any sort of consulting or advice to its municipalities on the whole process, including the letters.
Right, sure. That's another great question. Most of our interaction with our members regarding the CTP process is informing them of how to get involved, when they need to get involved, and on an as needed. It's anytime that we provide any sort of recommendations to them on specific things, it is when they approach us. We have 160 members, and it's just sorted out where it's worked out where when they come to us with a specific question, we're able to provide guidance and answers. Traditionally, we have not reached out advising on how to go about it other than the nuts and bolts.
And could someone remind us, and perhaps how many municipalities actually submit independent priority letters? I know we had the data once, I just don't remember.
Sure. Yeah, I looked at, I was looking at the MDOT website today under the CTP, and I went back through a couple years. It's not that many. It varies by county, of course, but it's a handful. I would say, 15 or 20, maybe.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to also ask you, perhaps, or the staff via you, this. We probably have gotten this, but is it possible to get sort of a simple summary of the history of HUR for the last X number of years, just that everybody has the same foundation? It started here, it went up during this legislative year, went down, because there's been a lot of history, and it's obviously an essential part, as highlighted by MML. It's probably in here somewhere, but it would be great to have a little compact HUR story if we could.
Yeah, you're gonna make me have to go back in time and think about all those wonderful days. So, but yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure.
We do have a lot of that data on hand. More than happy to provide anything to the commission if that would be helpful on the history.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Commissioner Winstead.
Bill, thanks for your testimony. I think it is a very strong statement about the need for continued funding, HUR funding. Obviously, the bipartisan infrastructure bill in 2022 to 26, we've seen multiple increases in funding to states on the highway side by five times the normal funding, transit even more. So obviously, position of MML is certainly backed up by the federal resources coming to the state. There's certainly ample funding now through that bill to be able to allocate sustaining levels of HUR funding on to municipalities. The other thing is your statement here references the local letters and input to the counties and through them to the states. I would say, like the MACO panel and comments by the commission, it is extremely important to many municipalities to be engaged in terms of what the infrastructure funding commitments are against local planning needs. I mean, MACO talked about that, about regional approaches, countywide approaches, matching approvals for development and next infrastructure funding. I would just say it's equally important on the municipal level as the county. Our municipality in Montgomery County is divided by a state highway, which carries 40,000 cars a day. It literally divides our community. So the impact of whatever the state does on that highway really has huge impacts to us. So I think your position is well taken. I see no reason why the funding levels can't be maintained given the amount of funds coming in from the federal, but thanks for your input.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. Next up, we have Matthew Hardy to give us the national. So we're going to zoom out to zoom back in. I think I'm now adjusting the apertures in different ways where we're going to, how small will it get or how big will it get? So thank you.
Bring up my own slides here, so I have them. So good afternoon, Chairman, Chair Principe, and the commission members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about the topic of transportation project prioritization, sort of at the national level. My name is Matt Hardy. I'm a senior manager at Spy Pond Partners, a small consulting firm. Prior to joining Spy Pond, I served as the Senior Program Director for Planning and Performance Management at the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, or AASHTO, for about 13 years. At AASHTO, I supported all the state DOTs in the development and implementation of national transportation policy related to the planning process and performance management. I also supported the state DOTs in developing, implementing, and sharing new and innovative programs like the project prioritization processes that you'll hear about today. And hopefully my presentation remarks will set the stage for both Brian and Holly when they get up here and talk about their more specific state-based programs. I want to begin with sort of asking the question of what is transportation planning? The specific details and nuances of how states are implementing transportation prioritization processes. We understand what the planning process is and how it fits within the broader context of transportation planning. So transportation planning is the process of looking basically at the current state of transportation in the region or a state or locality, designing for future transportation needs, and then combining all of that with the elements of budgets, goals, and policies, because no one has unlimited resources. It helps shape how a community or city grows by evaluating everything from streets and highways to cargo ships to public transit to bike lanes. Transportation planning can have a huge influence on almost anything from businesses to recreation to quality of life. The figure that's on the slide, hopefully you see that, is from Richmond, Virginia, and the MPO there, and sort of a visual of how the planning process works. But a community comes together and they might have lots of ideas, needs, and wants. And through the transportation planning process, a community determines a vision for what their specific goals and objectives are, and hopefully whittle down those many different needs and wants to what they can actually afford to build. The planning and engineering staff may identify the existing condition of assets or survey the region about future needs and wants and develop an overall needs assessment. But based upon those needs, a number of strategies will be identified, projects and programs of projects that address those needs. On the visual, the last three boxes, hard to see without it, represent sort of the programming process where specific projects are identified based upon available revenue, and sometimes through a formal, which you'll hear about later, prioritization process. Key here is that resources are limited and tough decisions need to be made on which projects get funded and which projects do not get funded. And then finally, hopefully the overall system, the projects you build, are monitored and evaluated. Did the projects yield the benefits and outcomes you expected, and have that feedback loop to improve the process and the projects in the future? So who does transportation planning? In addition to knowing what is the planning process, we need to know who's involved. You heard from some of those speakers before me today, but it's important to say that who is now involved in the planning process is very different from what it was 20, 30, and 50 years ago. Today, the planning process includes a lot of different players. At the core are either the state DOTs or the MPOs that serve primarily as a facilitator of the planning process. They in turn engage with many others from a technical or administrative perspective. Locals, counties, cities, municipalities, universities, consultants, transit agencies, and even federal agencies who are directly involved in that planning process and that overall decision-making process. They also might engage with others, other stakeholders as well. Those that are the citizens, the special interest groups, the associations, and others who live and work within the community. All of these groups and people are critical to making the transportation planning process a success. I keep on saying the planning process. Many may see planning as the development of a specific document or series of documents. Planning should be seen more as a process, and what we like to call a continuous, cooperative, and comprehensive process. The graphic here is from the Federal Highway Administration. While there are specific documents that must be developed, the DOT plan, the long-range plan, the statewide transportation improvement program, the focus is more on the process and the continued evolution of that process. Much of what we know of as transportation planning, and we refer to colloquially as the 3C process, can be traced back to federal legislation and requirements. And the federal government does play a very large role in influencing how transportation planning gets accomplished here in the United States. I would argue that all of the state DOTs, I would argue that all the state DOTs have many unique, different, and interesting approaches to conducting their planning process. But at the core, you could likely trace it back to what the federal government required back in 1962 with the passage of the Federal Highway Act. So a very brief federal legislative history in one slide. While the beginning of the federal highway program was in 1916, the first planning requirements really did not come about until 1962 with the 1962 Highway Act, which established the 3C process. Again, one that is continuous, cooperative, and comprehensive. Prior to that, planning was often done by engineers. I'm an engineer, so no offense, seen as experts with little to no input from the public. The engineers would often identify the most efficient route a roadway segment should take, sometimes to the detriment of the people living along that route. I would argue that we have learned a lot since this time. We are trying to fix those decisions made back then today, and we have a much better planning process to better engage with the public and the stakeholders. 1991 saw the passage of the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, or ICE-T, which included a large expansion of funding, authority, and planning requirements for the metropolitan planning organizations and the state DOTs. And it was not until the passage of the Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century, or MAP 21, we like our acronyms, that more substantial changes came to the planning process. As I will mention later, MAP 21 ushered in a new paradigm for transportation planning that placed more emphasis on establishing goals and objectives, and then allocating resources and identifying projects through a data-driven quantitative process. And you could see how those projects contribute and make progress toward your goals. Since MAP 21, other federal authorization bills have made some improvements around the edges, but fundamentally kept the planning requirements in place. But fundamentally, transportation planning is a state and locally driven process. The visual here, hopefully you can see it, is from Minnesota DOT and what they refer to as their family of plans. They establish a 50-year vision, and they have a more short-term 20-year statewide multimodal transportation plan. From that, they have individual modal plans that are developed by the individual agencies that cover different topics from ports and waterways, aviation, freight systems, bike, pedestrian, safety. And from that, they have other very sort of specific and detailed plans, a transportation asset management plan, a plan that's focused on intelligent transportation systems, transportation system management operations, connected automated vehicles, et cetera. So this is one example that's used throughout the US as probably a good example in terms of a process or approach put in place to kind of look at the planning process. But with respect to Maryland, MDOT has a number of plans themselves, which you have all probably heard of. The Maryland Transportation Plan sets that long-term vision for the state. The state also develops individual specific modal plans for rail, freight, bicycle, pedestrian that inform the Maryland Transportation Plan. And a strategic asset management plan that addresses the condition of current assets is also available. And finally, there are other plans like the Connected and Automated Vehicle Plan that lays out a vision for vehicle automation in the state. Lots of plans. Then there is the CTP, which provides a program of projects MDOT will fund over the next 6 years. And then finally, Maryland provides a feedback mechanism through the attainment report, which evaluates how well MDOT is achieving its goals and objectives. While these products are important, what is equally important is establishing the planning process to engage in a dialogue and discussion with the elected leaders, the public practitioners, decision makers with respect to transportation projects. I want to go back to Minnesota and sort of talk about the iteration that they have used. So what's interesting about Minnesota DOT is their focus on the planning process. Again, it is not that they developed a bike plan and put it on the shelf. They did that back in 2019. But if you look at the evolution of that bike plan, it began as a specific policy direction in their long-range transportation plan back in 2012. And over time, they took that and they have now developed a bicycle facility design manual that is used by the district offices, the consultants, the transportation community to support the design and implementation of bicycle facilities. That's one example of how planning can get done. As I mentioned in the beginning, planning eventually gets to identifying projects that we call programming. Over time, many state DOTs have focused more and more on this aspect by better linking the planning process to project selection, also through project prioritization processes. The example here, the figure on your right, is from Illinois in about 2007, when they were beginning to look at a project prioritization process. Illinois, along with many other state DOTs, had a planning process, in part because it was federally required. And they had a transportation programming process, but sometimes the two were not necessarily strongly linked with each other. What they did have likely resembled what you see here, all of the right elements, but not a defined process linking planning with programming and project selection. Illinois was experiencing limited coordination among the regional and state plans since each MPO developed their own planning documents. Many people, elected leaders, decision makers, the public, and practitioners saw the process as confusing with limited transparency. And this was not unique to Illinois. It's probably the same in many other state DOTs as well. And there was no feedback loop where you measure the benefits derived from the project over time to inform which project should be programmed in the future. The takeaway here is that states have been trying to address how to better link planning to project prioritization at various levels for at least the past 15 years. And a big push has been to integrate this idea, this concept of performance management principles into the planning process by linking the goals that an agency establishes with the projects being selected. That really came to light with MAP 21, as I mentioned earlier, the Moving Ahead for Progress in 21st Century Federal Authorization Law. That happened in 2012, but around 2010 is when Congress picked up on the need to better link the money being spent on transportation projects to the transportation system. And in 2012, MAP 21 was passed, which made some very significant changes to the planning process and ushered in what I would say is a new era for the federal aid program from a transportation performance management perspective. There were 4 major changes made that affected the planning process. First, Congress established at the national level goal areas for the first time. Congress created 7 goal areas focused on safety, infrastructure condition, congestion reduction, system reliability, freight movement and economic vitality, environmental sustainability, and reduced project delivery delays, similar to what many state DOTs establish in their long-range transportation plans. Second, Congress required US DOT to create performance measures that would be used to evaluate whether a state was making progress towards its performance targets. So there are now 15 national performance measures focused on safety, asset condition, and system operation. Third, it required state DOTs to establish their own performance targets for the performance measures established by US DOT. And fourth, the planning process itself was modified to be what we call more performance-based and ensure that there's a stronger connection between the planning documents, program development, and project evaluation. The basic concept that US DOT used to develop the performance-based planning process is represented here. 3 different circles. First, investment decisions should use goals, measures, and data to make better informed decisions about how to invest transportation funding. Second, these investments should be aimed at a better performing transportation system through the establishment of targets, developing plans, reporting results, and being held accountable for performance. And finally, the reason for doing this needs to center on the communities and the people through the efficient delivery of goods, and safe, reliable journeys to work, school, shopping, and activities. So performance management at both state and national levels has really focused on the project selection, on project selection, and showing the through line between the goals set forth by an agency and the projects that get implemented to deliver the results that are wanted. The performance management framework developed by FHWA, shown here on the slide on the right, it's the circle. As a joke, engineers get concerned about this because they like boxes. They don't like circles. They don't have like defined corners. So if you're an engineer, I'm sorry if it's a little squirmish for you. Probably more of a practitioner's perspective on how performance management works. This lays out the process and many of the details and nuances an agency must consider when it's implementing performance management. based upon an agency's goals and objectives, that sort of top box there, the strategic framework. An agency needs to select projects and programs that address those performance measures, monitor the performance of those projects, and then report and communicate that information back to decision makers to better inform future project selection processes. And I think that a lot of the discussion that was taking place prior to me getting up here kind of looked at that. Let's make a transparent process so we all know how projects are being selected and why one might not be selected over the other. Give me a yes or no reason. For me, that what this framework provides is a clear picture and understanding of project prioritization within the context of performance management. So I've talked a lot about the planning process, the federal requirements, performance management, and the role of project prioritization and selection within the new performance-based, the federally required performance-based planning process. The next question you may ask is, why do we even want to have a project prioritization process? What benefits does it provide? Well, the simple answer is shown here on the slide: to improve the transportation system. But the real answers, I think, are deeper and more nuanced. You also want to make informed decisions, right? Transportation prioritizations helps you to make informed decisions about where to invest your limited transportation dollars. By considering factors such as cost, environmental impact, economic impact, and community support, you can make sure that you are making the best decisions possible. Second, make the most of your limited resources. Transportation projects are expensive, and there are always more projects that need to be done than there is money to do them. By prioritizing your projects, you can ensure that you are spending your money on the projects that will have the biggest impact. And then finally, be transparent and accountable. Transportation project prioritization helps to be transparent and accountable. For the county and the city agencies, they know how the process works and how projects get selected. And for the public, you can show how you are making decisions about where to invest the limited transportation dollars. I want to get into a little bit more of the details of other states and kind of what they are doing, not to steal the thunder from either North Carolina or Illinois when it comes to project prioritization. There are many states doing project prioritization in one form or another. My next few slides focus in on 7 of them, and the 5 graphics here, the pictures, represent Virginia, Utah, California, North Carolina, and Illinois. One thing that I learned in studying public policy is the uniqueness of the United States and the ability to have all of these different policy experiments going on at the same time at different states. And it's no different with project prioritization. Each of these states is doing something a little bit differently, and we are all learning from each other. I would suggest that there are some important commonalities in the process that are being used. First, they're building trust in a data-driven process. They're promoting transparency and accountability. They're supporting the efficient allocation of revenue. These are for these states, it was legislatively required, and they're looking at funding availability. With a legislator will provide more funding if you have a data-driven process in place for selecting those projects. The first, the slide here talks about modes. So it's a table. The 7 different states are on the top. The row headers are basically how MDOT is currently set up. So you have the major, the key modal agencies. So you have SHA, MTA, the ports, TSO, MDTA, and then aviation. And it just shows for the other states which modes are included in the project prioritization process that they have in place. I will point out that typically none of these states have ports in there. So when you start thinking about a project prioritization process, it's important to consider which modes should be part of this prioritization process, and how might they not compete with each other, but how do you bring all those projects together and have to make decisions and sort through them for modes. The next common characteristics are the types of projects. So many of these focus in on capacity expansion, enhancement type of projects. So safety that looks at new safety projects, highway capacity expansion, transit rail capacity expansion, bike ped improvements, and then transportation demand management. The states, Virginia and California, both have separate processes in place, what we call SGR, or state of good repair. you would call it managing the existing assets, they both have processes in place where they go through a similar sort of prioritization or ranking process for their asset management type projects. The next slide talks about an important consideration for project prioritization is the metrics used to evaluate and rank the projects. This is where we can spend a lot of time and get into a lot of details in terms of how you might want to measure something. In my graphic here, I think about the performance metrics in terms of 3 different buckets: assets, outputs, and outcomes. And as you move from measuring the components of your system, the bridges, the highways, the track, the vehicles, your assets, to the benefits you hope to get, your outcomes, it becomes more challenging to do. State Highway Administration knows very well what the condition of all the pavements are or the bridges. Less known is how all that combines to provide long-term economic benefits, or how to improve the sense of place in terms of where I live, or address equity. It just becomes more challenging. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. There are just other externalities that kind of play into it. So another important aspect is developing the actual individual metrics and what you might use. For example, for safety, do you focus on crashes or crash rates? Do you focus on fatalities or fatality rates, or both? Is it more important to measure congestion levels or accessibility? Should we focus on the condition of the assets or the long-term economic benefits a project will deliver? It's not either or, but oftentimes rather both. We can measure both accessibility and congestion because both, I think, are important. Most of the current project prioritization processes measure these different areas in some way. So asset condition, outputs in terms of safety or the capacity of the transit system, or outcomes. Another common element is that for the states where this was legislatively required to implement a process, the law laid out the categories to be measured: safety, asset condition, equity, but left the development of the individual metrics to the staff at the DOT to establish. This was important, I think, for a couple of reasons. First, the details of a metric can be hard to build into legislation. And second, the performance metrics are continuing to evolve, and there is a need to let the process and the metrics used to evolve and improve as well. So getting to the end, finally, I want to talk about the benefits that many of the state DOTs have seen from implementing a project prioritization process. And from what I saw, there were 4 primary benefits. Number 1, better project selection. They created a data-driven process to get the right projects funded. They ensured project readiness. They improved the project development process and delivery pipeline so that projects are ready to go when funding is available. Third, they increased transparency. Stakeholders and constituents know how the process works. And 4, provide accountability, know how projects being funded meet state goals, and then provide feedback to the project sponsors. So my concluding thoughts here, I want to come back to the question that I stated earlier, and of interest, I think, to the Train Commission and the members here. Why do project prioritization? First, the process allows for making more informed decisions. Hopefully they will be better decisions, but you already have a lot of very smart and capable people at MDOT making these decisions. A project prioritization process can support more informed decision-making. Second, you want to make the most of limited resources. No state DOT has unlimited resources. The staff are making difficult decisions on how to spend limited resources, and project prioritization, a process in place, can help with that. However, it is important to note that a prioritization process is not really a substitute for funding and revenue. Where the money comes from is a separate and equally important question. And third, you want to be transparent and accountable. You want the stakeholders to know how the process works. And in my mind, I want my mom to be able to read and understand how the tax revenue being collected by the state is being spent on transportation projects that will hopefully benefit her, because she calls me up all the time asking me transportation questions. In conclusion, I think developing a project prioritization process like what North Carolina and Illinois are going to talk about is very important. Having a prioritization process benefits nearly everyone involved in the process, And Maryland has a very unique opportunity to learn from what other states have done to create a process that works even better. My only ask is that once you have the process in place and it's running smoothly, share what you learned with your friends at other states so we can continue to improve the process. Because if we go back to kindergarten, sharing is caring. And with that, thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Matthew. Appreciate that. Commissioners, you have questions for Matt? Commissioner Thompson.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Mic check. Okay. Thank you. Great presentation. Very informative. And I think that a performance-based process is it's great. It always runs the risk of leaving key community projects out that sometime DOT staffs may not necessarily always agree with. Because some of these projects, as was stated before, sometime it may take you years before you get enough public or funding support. But that doesn't mean the DOT staff should work on those projects until the capital is there. I want to ask you just a couple questions. One is on the area around, I wanted to get your thoughts, what other states are doing to integrate the strategies for clean transportation, especially in the EV sector outside of the NEVI funding. There's a lot of states and local governments around the country go to all these conferences and everyone's talking about the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is a down payment. It's not everything. What are you seeing in terms of best practices to increase what's happening on the highways, what also should be happening with ports, with transit facilities? One of the things that's just driving me crazy in our region is that we don't have adequate EV charging for the consumers at our transit stations. And people, I was just on a call a few minutes ago. I stepped out. Not only did someone at this table say they're closing their office, and because so many people work remotely. Meanwhile, I'm in real estate, and the real estate community is desperately trying to get people back in the office. And we're here saying we want to get people to have EV charging. I mean, to go back to work, we want to have all these aggressive goals, but the people that have cars, 100,000 in this state, hopefully that will dramatically continue to grow. But we're slow to the switch in having EV charging at transit stations for the riders. So I wanted to say, if you have any best practices that you're hearing about that people are doing to try to integrate it from a holistic approach as opposed to kind of a scattershot.
Yeah. So the best I can answer that, when at my time at AASHTO, I left back in March at AASHTO, the whole NEVI program and the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plans, I think, they were just getting started. So I don't think we have best practices being able to be identified right now because they're all being implemented in some way at every state. But I would think in 1, 2, 3 years, as that money gets spent and the states spend the money and they get the EV charging infrastructure out there, you'll be able to do that, go back in and kind of identify that. And I guess, as I mentioned, a great thing about the states is that they're all doing it a little bit differently and we can kind of learn from each other. I just don't think not that I know of sort of best practices, but there is a whole sort of research program out there called National Cooperative Highway Research Program that the state DOTs fund. And I almost guarantee you that at some point there's going to be a project that says, let's look at the NEVI program and how that money was spent. And are there any sort of great examples that we can share with others?
Yeah, I'm really interested in making sure we're not, a lot of what's happening is there's just not enough holistic approach, right? So we got, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector, but I think we need to kind of look at that.
But I think there are states that are looking at installing, the EV charging. They're all doing it differently. And I had to imagine that transit, at transit stations and everything, that there are states that are doing that. I could put you in touch with somebody at AASHTO that would probably have that information.
Sure,
better
that'd be
than me.
great.
Yeah.
That'd be great. So just two other quick questions. You talk a lot about equity. And one of the things I was interested in is, there's around the country, transportation planning has been a challenge from an equity lens for well over 50 years, right? The two areas that I find that is lacking in terms of adequate diversity is in housing planning and in transportation planning. And they have such an outsized role on the impact around equity in communities. And I say this in context, I was in the state senate in New York and everyone now is talking about reconnecting communities too, especially with all the money. But so many communities have been ripped apart because of bad transportation planning. And I just wanted to know if there's anything that you are seeing nationally to get diversify the staffing so that we can have better planners and project managers and engineers so that we can right some of the wrongs from the past and make a better future. Because if you just have a top-down approach, right, saying this is what people need to do, but you don't have the workers on the front lines who are doing the planning, who are engaging with the community and who are saying, hey, as we talk about what projects we should pick and what projects we should do right to do the restorative process, and we don't have the right equity lens on that, how do we really fix it?
Yeah. I think one great example to look at that I would point you to is the reconstruction of Interstate 94 that connects Minneapolis and St. Paul. That devastated, I forget the name of the community. I mean, it tore it apart. And the interstate itself is at the end of its life cycle and it has to be replaced. And Minnesota DOT has a very concerted effort, ongoing to try to re-envision what do we do, with this interstate that caused so much damage, to the communities. So if you want specific examples, I would look at them. And, to your point of we just can't have like engineers and planners make, in the room facilitating conversations. They went out and they try to get the people doing the facilitation should represent the people, in the communities that they're going out to. So they wanted to have not just white people, but, multicultural people and everything kind of going out there. And part of that goes back to the education. So we are, from a planning perspective, a project that I worked on at AASHTO was, what's the planner of the future? What do they look like? What kind of talents do they need? And it really goes back to training and education at the university and the college level, and trying to get different people involved in getting a degree in civil engineering or transportation planning or whatever, and taking that what you've learned and working at a state DOT or a consulting firm that's helping them. And so that's been going on, I would say, as well. And I can point you to some specific projects that kind of looked at that. It was done through, again, I mentioned the NCHRP program. It was done through that research program.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Commissioner Kirchhoff.
Thank you again for that presentation. Do you have any, there's parts of Maryland where you have a very distinct regional economy that involves multiple states. So for example, our MPO involves half Washington County as well as Berkeley County and Jefferson County, West Virginia. So when we're doing regional planning, we're actually doing multi-state. It actually up till 10 years ago included parts of Pennsylvania. But do you have any insights on how that multi-state is considered into transportation planning when you see that?
Yeah, so there are a lot of what we call sort of bi-state or tri-state MPOs that have to work with, the Washington Council of Governments is one example here. So there are a lot of examples of that throughout the US. The sister organization to AASHTO is the Association of Metropolitan Planning Organizations, or AMPO. They have a staff there. Bill Caruso is the executive director, and they have lots of examples, reports and everything about how these multi-state MPOs kind of work, and that idea of best practices or some common practices. So I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but I know that there are lots of them because when I was at AASHTO, we all had to work, together. But I would point you to AMPO and say, hey, do you have any good examples of how this is working in other states, with MPOs that cross boundaries like that?
Thank you. Thank you. Commissioner Winstead.
Hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, great. On your chart that talks about common characteristic modes, you know, you selected 7 states and you compared the 5 modes of MDOT compared to them. And obviously absence of port and absence of aviation are common amongst those 7, right? If you looked at all the 50 state structures, would it be a similar picture? I mean, would you basically have very, very few states that have both port and aviation under?
Yes, I think Maryland is unique in terms of all, like having the transit, the MTA actually operating like the red line in Baltimore.
Right.
Having ports underneath them, having aviation. There are some states that have that structure, but I would say most of the state DOT, I take that back. I'd have to go look, but lots of the state DOTs aren't as like diverse in terms of modes that MDOT has. Like the structure is fairly unique compared to other states.
Right, and given, you know, and I know that since the start of MDOT, you know, we've been very proud about the multimodal approach. Given your background in AASHTO and advising states and having 50 state secretaries there to talk about their structures, was there much evidence or have you read much analysis of the benefits of multimodal planning and funding on meeting mobility and transportation needs statewide? Has there been much analysis about that? I mean, flexibility to dip into a trust fund to fund a particular project in a mode that doesn't have the funds to do it obviously would be a benefit, right? But have you seen any studies that either AASHTO or others have done that sort of look at the multimodal benefits of it?
Well, I mean, there are lots of studies that look at the benefits of doing multimodal planning, right? Just making sure you don't just look at highways, but highways and transit and bike and ped. From the state level, my experience, so I wasn't on like, AASHTO has a committee for everything. So they have a committee on finance and funding. And if you go to that committee, there are lots of examples where, you know, I'll probably get this wrong, but like Washington State, very multimodal DOT. But in terms of the tax revenue coming in, oftentimes it's earmarked, right? The legislature says, it's great that you're multimodal, but this tax here, this is going towards only can fund highways or something like that. So they're oftentimes handcuffed in terms of how they can spend the money. And we see that a lot, you know, in some of the states. But I think all the states would agree that yes, multimodal planning at the state level is important because it's a multimodal system that we're looking at. But I'd have to go back and kind of just do a quick search in terms of, you know.
See, sorry. Can find, I don't know why. It's not,
Frank is messing with you.
You're good.
apologize. So Matthew, on the funding level, it'd be good to, I'd be interested to know whether AASHTO or, you know, what is the federal study agency, TRB? Whether any of those agencies have studied on the funding side, the benefits of multimodal structure for an agency. I think that would be helpful to the commission.
Okay.
Thank you.
Commissioner Kane.
Sorry.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question on the common characteristics and the performance metrics that you have here. You don't have them in any kind of specific list. Do states use them this way, like, or do they actually have special lists, like they put safety first and then image and whatever?
I think, not to speak for the states, but I think the way they list them, I was trying, so this is like a construct that I was taught and kind of, you know, think about when I think about performance metrics. I also teach a class, so I you know, to my students to think about the different types of measures, but you know, the way you list something is oftentimes your importance level, right? So oftentimes states will say, yeah, safety is our most important priority, clearly, you know, end stop. And then after that, you know, asset condition, things that we, you know, own and have to maintain. So some states do list them and say first, second, third. Others just list them and say these are all equally important because we can't just consider safety without, you know, managing the assets as well, right? So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
For that graphic, I was just trying to say that there are different types of metrics out there. long-term ones, short-term ones, then we have specific control over. I could put more money and spend more money on maintaining the bridges, and the bridge condition will increase. I could build as many transit systems as I wanted to, but it doesn't mean that it's going to have economic benefit because I built them in a field with no land use or anything like that. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Henninger.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I think that what I'm seeing here is the effort to get towards objectivity when it comes to reviewing of proposals for various projects. And obviously that is a very good goal. And it's a good goal because it limits at least three things. One would be abject corruption or the appearance of abject corruption, which is often not what people think it is. The second thing that it limits is discretion between administrations, which we can certainly see in our own state and in many others. But the third thing it also limits is responsiveness to changing conditions and or special considerations, such as equity, reconnecting communities, those sorts of things. Those things can be incredibly expensive on paper, and some of the benefits might not show up on paper. So to what extent can we really trust that these processes will arrive at anything relatively objective, as opposed to, you know, the thing that that comes back to my mind is the issue of gerrymandering and kind of going back and forth between different administrations, and trying, and each one saying that their model is the objective model and an objective way to split the pie. Is there any way to get towards objectivity without giving up each of those three items?
I think so. I think one aspect is making the process transparent and open and publishing, right? Saying, here's how we do it. Here's how we're measuring safety, or here's how we're measuring the cost of a project or something like that. Just making that known to everybody. The other one I think that is important to the responsiveness is to allow for flexibility and evolution, as I talked about, that, you know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we weren't talking about equity really at all. But if you look at many of the state DOTs and the MPOs that have to develop plans, it's a big part of their plans now. And when you create a process, you know, like a project prioritization process, you need to allow for evolution and changes. You're not going to get it right the first time out of the gate. You do it once, okay, let's go back and evaluate not the projects, but the process itself. And can we make any changes? And setting it up that you can make changes and add metrics or whatever in the future. So I think you can do that. The discretion between administrations, I think that one, I've never been a political figure really. So I mean, it'll always be there, I think. But in my opinion, if you set the process up where you publish and people know how it works and you build trust in it, then hopefully as administrations change, they'll say, oh, the state DOT, those professionals, they know what they're doing. You know, it's a process that's been in place and the public trusts it. And if I change it, I might get into trouble or something like that.
Thank you. Commissioner Flora.
Hi.
Hi.
This is really, I think, for you, Mr. Chair and everyone, but as a planner, I absolutely believe in planning processes, but I think starting with the vision is almost too late. I'm really beginning to wonder what's our timeline. We've seen major market disruptors, particularly in transportation in the last 10 years. And just to name a few, you know, scooters, work from home, EVs, you know, shortage of drivers, the whole design standards that are out there, use of solar embedded, you know, asphalts. Our timeframes don't work anymore. There was a time when all we were dealing with were highways and trains and pretty basics. And so if you really look at the trajectory, when you get to the vision and the goals, people don't know what they don't know. We don't know enough about new technologies and market disruptors and what's happening to really be thinking thoughtfully about where we're going, you know, and I think that that's something, you know, the best of planning processes when you're looking at 30, 40-year horizons aren't working anymore is my challenge. And so to enter into a planning process without having some of those types of market disruptors, inputs, what's going on in applied research, what's happening out there, I think is going to result in us perhaps missing the mark because we aren't really realizing what's yet to come. So I just want to kind of throw that out there. And I thought this was a good moment to do that because I think we have to change what we've commonly known as the planning process because it's too long of a time frame. The timeframes don't work anymore. And with transportation, I know we have to think about funding and long term, but I think we've got to really look at this differently. So I think this is a moment. It's not really a question so much as a comment to other planners about it's time to think about this differently.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Commissioner Stevens.
Yes, thank you for your presentation and thank you, Commissioner Flora, for your comments. It sort of leads to what my question. One of the trends and disruptors is the rise of electric bikes, the impact that's having on commuting options and lengths of travel. I'm wondering, I look in this chart on the common characteristics by modes, and I see that Illinois, North Carolina, and Ohio don't include their active transportation efforts in their CTP process. I'm wondering, and they don't show up under any of the modes. Can you say where that is commonly listed in terms of bike and ped and active transportation, micromobility? Where are those kinds of planning processes falling in the mode list there?
Yeah, I'll let Brian, when he gets up here from North Carolina, talk about the specifics of North Carolina. I just don't know them as well. But I think many of those projects are like a smaller scale. And whether or not they get included in the process, the project prioritization process is sort of a question just because of how much money they are, how much funding they require. So I don't really have a good answer for you.
Where there's do you know if AASHTO or anyone else would have an assessment of where those planning processes fall in different states?
So the planning process is, I thought you were referring to actually within the prioritization process.
Or where on that chart, highway transit, some places I know they're in the highway office and some in Maryland, they're in the secretary's office, like where that work falls.
Yeah, I think most state DOTs have a bike plan, a bike pedestrian sort of coordinator. A lot of the planning would happen within the state DOT. Every state DOT is structured a bit differently. So I don't know if is it the equivalent of SHA or is it the equivalent of TSO, within Maryland? I don't know that, but there at AASHTO, there's an active transportation council that looks at bike ped, which might have that sort of matrix of that. But I know that many state DOTs develop a bike ped plan in terms of where they want their state to go. Many MPOs also have sort of a bike ped plan in terms of that gets down into, okay, we want to focus in on connecting this network together, knitting it together with more bike lanes or specific projects or areas that are ripe for, bike ped improvements.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Tolkien, you have the last bite at this apple.
I was actually going to ask you, we have a couple different speakers who it seems like all are touching on aspects of prioritization and data process. And I think a lot of us are chomping at the bit to get into the conversation and maybe using some of our speakers as vehicles for group questions. Would it help if we had all the speakers and then save the broader conversation for the end? I just wonder if we're asking some questions that might be answered by the later presenters or benefit from those presentations.
How do you feel? I think we'll have to take that back to the staff and talk some more about how we can capture that within future meetings.
Sure. Yeah. Just curious about the flow.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Thank you. All right. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Brian, you're up next.
First, I want to say thank you all for having me here today. I appreciate the opportunity to come to speak to you about North Carolina's prioritization process. What I am hearing you all go through are many of the same aspects that we have gone through. So there is some information that we're more than happy to share with you. What we're going to present to you today is sort of where we've come from with our system, in general, how it works from a legislative perspective, and some of the key takeaways that we have to share with you about that. What I would be interested in doing, and again, going back, I know time is running short. There's a lot of follow-up that we can provide on some of the details on how we've worked some of these out. I heard someone earlier mention that we were talking about problems, but haven't come up with some solutions. I don't have a whole lot of time, I think, today to go into those solutions, but I do have more that I can share with you at a later time. So I wanted to just offer that to you right now before we get too far down the road. So we'll go through our presentation today. Three general topics that we want to look at. First, the background. When it comes to our system, it's very important to know where we came from. Much of our system is course correcting from previous systems. So that's a very critical part. Some education about how our legislation works. I think our legislation is unique compared to many other states. So I want to give you those nuances. And then lastly, some key takeaways. So with that background, there was a strong desire within our state to develop a project selection reform. What I heard very early at the start of this meeting are some of the same things that we were dealing with in North Carolina. Public wanted politics removed from the process. They weren't sure how projects got selected, and they wanted a better way forward. And so that was very important to our citizens of North Carolina. That led to a conversation of why should we prioritize? One of the things that NCDOT did was engage McKinsey Consulting to come in and examine our current system and see what was working and what was working well. There were a number of items that came out of that. One item that came out of that had to do with a need to fund and prioritize statewide initiatives. So I heard some conversations earlier about counties and regions and statewide. That was something that we struggled with early on. And we'll show you some of how we deal with that in North Carolina, because that is a very important role. You have needs at all those levels, and you don't want to let any one level go unaddressed. So that was very important with us, and that's built into our system. We have some other things. Near-term orientation rather than focus on meeting long-term goals. But then I just heard our planning director here from Maryland mention about how that general planning process is difficult, and that is something that we struggle with as well. So lots of similar things. What the state did is engage a number of stakeholders, similar to the process that you're going through now, to look at those priorities, to come up with those and to build those into the legislation. And then ultimately that led to our legislation. It was passed, I think, in 2023 when it was officially signed in. We call our legislation the STI legislation, is what we refer to as the Strategic Transportation Investment Legislation. It guides our process. We actually undertook a couple of cycles prior to the legislation when there were executive orders in place. So it was actually our third cycle that occurred under the legislation. You'll hear me refer to things such as P3, that's prioritization 3.0, that's the third cycle. We are in the middle of P7 right now, which is our seventh cycle. So knowing where we come from, we can start to discuss our legislation. And our legislation is really the driving force for our process. What is very interesting about our legislation, and what I think works so very well, is that there are certain things that are enumerated and spelled out within that legislation, and there are certain things that are left to what is called the work group to come up with. And I think that is a really good framework. Now, what I think Maryland or any other state will need to figure out is, what is that level of flexibility that's right for you? I can't answer that for your state, but I can give you some experience on what we developed. So things like funding categories and percentages, and those categories, those are those statewide, regional, and division. Our legislation spells out what those categories are and how much money goes to each category. It identifies project eligibility. Certain projects can compete at certain categories and certain other ones cannot. We score a total of 6 modes within our process: highway, bike and ped, rail, transit, ferry, and aviation projects. They're all within our system. The legislation enumerates the criteria that we have to use in highway, but leaves the other up to the work group to decide what those criteria are. The measures, and you heard some of this earlier in the conversation, all measures are up to the work group to figure out and decide. So you can see how that process plays out and that flexibility comes in. Some of the things that are developed by our work group includes the scoring process itself. That's the time frame. We have submittals. Each group is given so many submittals that goes into our system. So that is capped by that, but there are various ways to handle that. Under our criterias, we have what are known as measures and weights. A measure is how we measure a criteria. The weight is how much weight we give to that criteria. So there's a lot of flexibility there within the work group to respond to changing conditions as needed, more within the highway or in the non-highway modes because the criteria are eligible for the work group to decide. The funding allocation between modes, something that we refer to as normalization, is something that the work group gets involved in. Our legislation wants us to put all of our projects into one bucket and pick the highest scoring ones. Our work group is not yet comfortable with that. The enumerated criteria within highway are very much focused on single occupancy vehicle throughput. And so it is difficult to compare a highway score to a non-highway score. However, throughout our process, because we are required to have everything score on a 0 to 100 point scale, and because we've done a number of iterations, our scores are now starting to line up in that same row. And so what that means is, even though a 25 score in highway isn't necessarily a 25 in transit, they're all coming in at about that same range. So we've kind of gotten there, even if we went at a bit of a circuitous route. And lastly is how we allow for our local areas to submit their priorities within that system. And that's something that we refer to as local input points. I heard someone here earlier mention how local areas sometimes have those different needs and different priorities in your state office. And this is a way for local areas to put their thumb on the scale and help get those projects that are important to them over the funding line. So some aspects of our scoring that are legislatively mandated. The biggest one is the 0 to 100 point scale. That really helps with transparency. That is a little difficult because most of our data is not on a 0 to 100 point scale. So that conversion to 0 to 100 does take some work. We have a process that I think works pretty well, but it is not perfect. We do a ranked order process. So it is what percentage of projects have a equal or lower score that it becomes your 0 to 100 point scale. Our legislation also requires that we select our projects in that ranked order, which means there's no skipping. We fund from the highest scoring down. When the money runs out, we stop. It works well in North Carolina. There are some hiccups. Other states have opportunities to work outside of that just single ranked order. I think that there's some validity in that, but you lose sort of some transparency with that. So that's the trade-off that you have to think about as you're going through that. And then last, our legislation lists the highway criteria names. And so within highway, we have 10 total criteria that we can utilize. They are congestion, benefit cost, safety, freight, economic competitiveness, accessibility and connectivity, multimodal, lane width, shoulder width, and pavement score. So we're measuring both current conditions and future projections. We're measuring both throughput as well as geometric conditions, trying to bring that all together within one scoring system for highway. We have a funding distribution within our system that I think has been very helpful in getting adoption. And what we have is a 40-30-30 funding split within our state. 40% is for our statewide projects. And that goes back to the McKinsey report. The McKinsey report said North Carolina was having difficulties with that. Our previous system allocated our funds equally to each of our 14 highway divisions. Those highway divisions were based on our prison boundaries from 1920 or so, and those did not match where our population is today. As you can imagine, many states, particularly North Carolina, have seen a lot of changes since then. Because the money was distributed equally, it wasn't following the population well, which meant certain areas were potentially being overserved and certain were underserved. Now, I think it was a great system for a large state like North Carolina, especially from a geographical perspective, to do a system build out. But to go from system build out to system maintenance, we really had to go to something else. So we have 40% of our money goes to our statewide mobility projects. 30% is to regional impact. A region is made up of 2 of our highway divisions, so there are 7 regions. An interesting thing about that is the money at that level is distributed to those regions based on the proportion of the population of the state. So it is not an equal distribution among the 7 regions based on population. And again, that's trying to align funding with where the population is, because generally population equals needs. However, our division needs, our last 30%, is distributed equally across all 14 of our divisions. And that's a recognition of the fact that we have needs throughout the entirety of our state, and we need to address those needs. We can't just simply focus on the urban areas or the statewide items. For transportation to work in a state, all 3 levels need to be addressed. That statewide, that inter regional, and then that local. They all have to work together to provide good transportation. Within our legislation, we have a number of, I don't want to call them necessarily carve-outs, but definitions of what can qualify. I'm not going to go too deep into the table. You have that if you want to look into that. We have some graphics following up there that I think do a great job of showing how that looks. So the first is for highway and the eligibility at the various levels. Our statewide level involves our interstates and our NHS routes. It is approximately 5% of all centerline miles, but it's carrying, I think, about 15 to 16% of all the traffic in the state. So this is our backbone. This is what connects us internally and us to the rest of the country. Our next category is our regional impact. This is about 15% of all centerline miles. This is everything with a US or NC route designation that is not at our statewide. So anything that's got a numbered sign on it is in our regional impact. And then last is our division needs, which involves our secondary road system, which is approximately 80% of all centerline miles within our state. One thing to know about North Carolina, I'm not sure how aware you all are of this. North Carolina has no county road network. That means our state owns almost all of the roads within our states. That occurred as a result of the Great Depression. So this goes back to that time frame. And again, thinking about what North Carolina's population was in the 1920s and 30s compared to now, with the state taking over all ownership essentially from that point on. By far and away, the bulk of our roads are owned by the state of North Carolina. It is Texas and NCDOT 1-2 as far as states that own the most centerline miles. That creates a unique situation for our system in that we're trying to score things from interstates down to almost local roads. That creates some interesting complications. We also have eligibility at our aviation. We have approximately 93 airstrips within our state, almost 1 per county. Our major 5 airports are eligible at that statewide mobility category. Our next 5 commercial service airports are at the regional impact. And then our 83 GA strips are eligible at our division needs category. Now, one thing that our legislation does do is it limits funds to aviation. That's because our airports, our major ones, are airport authorities, which means they have mechanisms for generating their own revenue. Our system also takes that into account. Our system gives a lot of benefits to bringing additional funds to the table. The aviation mode is able to do that because they have that authority structure. By limiting the amount of funds that can go to aviation, we take that all into account. So very interesting structure when it comes to aviation. We also fund rail projects. 2 takeaways here. The graphic that you see is our statewide eligibility network, and these are our major facilities owned by either the North Carolina Railroad Company, CSX, or Norfolk Southern. So this is again, our backbone network of rail within the state. Our short line operators are not eligible for funding under our system. I'm not sure how that would translate to Maryland, different geographical scales that we're talking about, but that is one carve out within the rail category. And then last but not least, we have a few other funding caps. The one that I want to spend the time talking with you about today involves that corridor cap. Just so you understand that, as I mentioned earlier, North Carolina is made up of 14 divisions. the corridor cap says that we're only allowed to spend so much money on any one corridor within a division or the adjacent divisions. And the short answer to that, what that really translates down to is we have statewide needs across the state, and we need to make sure that we're spending that money across the state, not just solely on one area. And this has been important. It's helped us distribute some funds around. It has not really hindered us too much as far as meeting the needs and following our scoring system. But it is, again, another reflection of we can't let one area soak up all the funds. We need to distribute these funds across the state. One area that I think could be very helpful with Maryland in hearing you work through some of these items, what North Carolina utilizes is what's known as a work group process. So the work group shall endeavor to continually improve the methodology and criteria through the use of a work group process. We conduct our cycle every 2 years. We update our STIP every 2 years. So there's a prioritization process that feeds into that STIP update. As part of that 2-year process, we engage our work group to go over our system, to make refinements, to reconfirm, and to adjust. And the way our work group works is there are 4 MPO representatives on that work group. In North Carolina, we have what's known as rural planning organizations. This is a statewide system. These are not RTPOs that may be coming from FHWA, but our RPO network covers the entirety of the state that is not covered by MPOs. Now, this does not address all of the concerns that were raised earlier about, while MPOs are force multipliers, and they are. I actually started my career in an MPO, so I really appreciate them. They have limited staff. Even in our system, our RPOs, which can be 4 and 5 counties, are frequently staffed by 1 person. So we're asking a lot of our partners. We do have 2 units within NCDOT to help with this. There's the SPOT office. That's the office that I run. We work with the work group. We implement the scoring. That's our process. We also have what's known as our corridor development engineer group, and they work with our RPOs and our smaller MPOs to help address that staffing deficiency that you heard mentioned here earlier. So the state is putting significant resources, not just into the delivery of this, but to assisting our areas with making sure that they're submitting good projects and getting in the best possible items. So 8 of our representatives come from MPO and RPO. Then we have our external partners who are part of our group. This includes the Metro Mayors Coalition, League of Municipalities, Regional Councils of Government, and the Association of County Commissioners. All of that is legislatively mandated. Those 12 representatives have to be on our work group. What we have done since then is add the North Carolina Rural Center. They are a 13th member. Again, they are not legislatively mandated, but it was the work group's belief that they represented a swath of the population that wasn't quite as representative as it needed to be. From there, the legislation says that not more than half of the work group shall be made up of NCDOT staff. And so there are right now 13 members from NCDOT. We have 4 division engineers on there. Again, our division engineers are the leader of our 14 divisions. These are very high level staff within our organization. They're right at the border between policymakers and staff, right? Then we have our multimodal representative. We have a Deputy Secretary, Julie White, for multimodal, who is part of the group to make sure that they are incorporated. And then we also have the SPOT office and subject matter experts, remainder of the members of the work group session or structure. Couple of things to point out. For our last cycle, we met virtually from October through May once a month, and then in person once a month. So a number of meetings to help look at and refine our system. And again, remember, this is our 7th iteration. So we've got a lot of history and a lot of things that we've learned. We're still meeting that frequently. And then the biggest complaint that I heard from our work group is we don't have enough time. So there's always a desire to look at more. With the work group, you have to have them focus on quality over quantity. It's very easy to want to do a lot. There's a lot of needs. There's a lot of things that we want to accomplish. But you really got to focus because some of the questions are really difficult to answer. So you got to spend that time with them. Our work group works on consensus. So I heard some questions earlier about how do we deal with changes within administrations and some of those items. It is a work group, so, we're all humans. There's some bias there. We simply can't get around that. However, by having 26 that represent very diverse parts of our state and working on a consensus model, we're taking actions to mitigate those concerns. I won't say we're perfect. We are still humans. We all still make mistakes. But I think it works very well for addressing those concerns. Now, 26 is a large group. I'm a big fan of the 2 pizza rule, right? You got a group larger than you can feed with 2 pizzas for lunch. It's hard to make decisions. But we're talking about a lot of money and we need to do this right. Our 10-year program is over $30 billion. And so we need voices at the table. And I heard some earlier mentioning those disruptors within transportation. If you were going to pursue that work group process, I would think heavily about that. One of the things that we deal with is knowing that what we're planning for 30 years out will be different than what we need. And so how do we bring that into our system? When do we start to adapt? Very difficult. Bringing those voices to the table would be very helpful. We also have an advisory group that assists our work group that sits in the meetings. We refer to them as non-voting members. The work group has taken all of 1 vote in the time that we have met throughout the process. We always work on consensus otherwise. But when it comes to that consensus, it's that group that makes that, and our advisory members are again there to help out and support. So that's generally how it works in North Carolina. What you're not seeing is the details that come in with our scoring system. And again, I will offer that again. I'd be happy to speak further to this group about that. That's a bit of a longer conversation, but there's some really unique things that we've done within our scoring system. We use a lot of percent change as opposed to total change to address those rural urban issues, right? Our economic competitiveness criteria looks at gross domestic product and the change within the county. We're looking at percentage change, not total change, right? Same thing with jobs. I live in Wake County, which is a major part of the state, a major source of both jobs and population. I will never say that 100 jobs is nothing, but 100 jobs comes to Wake County, I don't know, every 2 or 3 days, it seems like. 100 jobs to some of our rural counties is much more different. And so we're trying to find that way to balance those urban and rural needs within our system. And so some of the takeaways that I want to leave you with is building that right balance of flexibility and rigidity. You need to make sure that your work group, at the end of the day, they're a technical work group. So you need to provide them the structure to do that, but you also need to leave some of that flexibility so that it can change with the time. We've gone through, I think, about 5 different funding processes within the state of North Carolina, and they all start out well, but they all end up crumbling under their rigidity. I think that's what's different about our version right now is that work group process allows for that flexibility. But again, if you're going to allow technical folks to make those decisions, you have to have some checks. You have to have some limitations on those. I think that's only fair. Takeaway 2, building engagement and buy-in to the system is very, very critical. This is one place where our work group has really helped out because our MPOs and RPOs sit on the work group, and because they are also the project submitters. When they leave the work group, they're not just educational forces, but they're advocates for the system because they were invested in it. And because they're speaking to their locally elected officials, be that either county, municipal level, or even state level, it creates that buy-in through the MPO and RPO community, and then through the political community. The department also invested a lot of time after the legislation was passed to do a lot of education. I have done a lot of education in my time. Coming to Maryland, that's a first for me to come outside of the state. But these are the kinds of educational efforts that we undertake. They're not insignificant because for people to trust it, they need to know it, they have to buy in. So that engagement and buy-in is really important. But I'm happy to see a lot of that happening here today, right? You all are creating that engagement. I heard earlier about your survey, trying to reach out to more folks. I would just say that is a great thing to do. Continue to build that engagement and buy-in within your system. Data is our friend. It's also our limiting factor. We are a very data-driven process. At the statewide mobility, the score is entirely based on data. There is no local input. And so that's great. It provides a lot of transparency. But you heard earlier some mentions that there are new ways of measuring things that are always coming online, new data sets. And particularly in North Carolina, where we are trying to have a system for so many different types of roads at so many different levels, sometimes that data doesn't trickle all the way down the way we need it to. So data is both a limiting factor and our friend. So always keep that in mind as you're going through those. But again, this is another reason why you build that flexibility into your system, because that data just tends to get better, right? Data doesn't seem to be getting worse and smaller. It seems to be getting better and larger. So you want to have that flexibility in there. And two, if you enumerate a data source, that's probably the best way to make sure that it gets gone in a couple of years, right? And then last but not least, the fourth takeaway I want to leave you with is who sets policy. And this is particularly important in North Carolina. Part of the perception of the overt political influence within our state came from how the Board of Transportation interacted with the project selection process. Our STI legislation requires that we take our package to the Board of Transportation for approval, but it keeps them out of the nitty-gritty work. And so that can create sometimes a policy vacuum. Our legislative members frequently come to our meetings, so that's one way to fill it. But I think that that's an important thing to recognize too, is how do you build in that interaction to make sure that those policies are moving into your prioritization process in the ways that you want them to? And how do you allow your technical staff on your work group to ask those questions to policymakers so they can consider them and give feedback? These cycles, they're not short, right? 2 years goes by very quickly, but 2 years is also, as we were talking about earlier, a very long time within a planning horizon. The only way to get better is to iterate, don't start out with something that's terrible, but start out with something that's good and then take it from there. So figuring out those ways and those methods so that your work group can speak to your policymakers and get that information flowing back and forth is really important. That helps your work group focus. That helps them really narrow down on how to actually implement. And then also make sure that those policy discussions stay at the appropriate policy level. I think it's very important that our work group is made up of technical representatives from across the state. You heard that the division engineers are on there. They are very high level representatives. We have our NC-AMPO board president also on our work group. So we have some very high level folks within our work group, but they're also just shy of that policymaking area. And so you've got to find that way to let that communication happen and fill that void so that your entire organization can work together into one shift. And so with that, that is my presentation. Again, happy to go through more in depth. Happy to talk about how our scoring actually works as well to provide you some of those solutions at some point in time.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
That's very helpful. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Awesome.
Commissioners, I see Commissioner Winstead.
Yes, sir.
2 years since the legislation, and you explained it very well.
Thank you.
It's very valuable input. Let me ask you back on the scoring, legislative scoring element when you're talking about the highway quantitative criteria. How have you dealt with the impacts of telework in the last couple of years? I mean, really looking at the shift in terms of AM and peak hour demand and how that's been reflected in kind of the system.
That's a fantastic question. We utilize AADT within our process quite extensively. We actually use something called peak ADT, which is the AADT from the peak month. And that has to do with much of our state being highly tourist influenced. Both our mountains and our coast have a lot of tourist traffic. So we're trying to make sure we're capturing that within our system. One of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about in the work group this time is which data to utilize as far as AADT was concerned. We ultimately decided to use 2018 and 2019 data. We need to use 2 consecutive years. Our work group didn't feel comfortable with 2020 and 2021 data because of the impacts to COVID. Felt more comfortable with 2022, but we didn't want to do 2022 and 2019. That didn't feel right to us. So we have those mechanisms in place and we have that data collection in place so that we can quickly take that information, bring it into our system and carry on from there. And then because all of our projects compare against one another, it has an impact on how projects rank within our system. So there's natural mechanisms to utilize that new data to bring that in and to update those scores every 2 years. So it's reflective of that.
Commissioner Sakata.
Thank you for coming.
Oh.
Your presentation. Maryland and North Carolina, similar in ways, but a little different,
Mhm.
right? NCDOT has around 76,000 miles. And Maryland has about 17,000 lane miles that DOT, SHA manages. But total about 71,000 in our state, which obviously are county, state, local roads. How would you incorporate those state, local officials into the planning prioritization process using your NCDOT model?
Yeah, so what's really helpful for us has been that RPO network. The RPO network is funded through SPR dollars, which are federal funds from our transportation legislation. And it creates that network and infrastructure of long-range planning within the rural areas of our state. We have a very robust MPO association. And so the RPO association actually started before our STI legislation, but the STI legislation really gave them a shot in the arm. I don't want to say legitimacy, that's not quite the right word, but I know that time is short, so let's go with legitimacy with an asterisk on it. So we had some of those communication infrastructure items already in place that we could take advantage of through that. There's also, again, with our county commissioners and League of Municipalities representatives, we're finding ways to also bring them involved. I don't know the specifics here within Maryland of what communication structures you have in place, but that would be my recommendation is, communications always work better when you're tapping into existing networks as opposed to trying to create new ones, right? That's planning 101. You go to where the people are, you work with their networks, you don't try and create a new network. So with that, that would be my recommendation. Again, without knowing the specifics, but I will put in a plug. If you don't have an RPO network set up, I would highly encourage you to look at that. That's been very wonderful within our state, bringing the rural areas of our state together, giving them a voice at the table, making sure they're represented. So that's, I think, very helpful. It's also been a good way to help that cross-county collaboration. Nothing's forced, but it gives the counties an existing network relationships to start that process from. So I think that's been very helpful for us. Yeah.
Is an RPO different than how is it different than an MPO?
Yeah, so an MPO is federally mandated. It's for an area with over 50,000 population. They get a certain set of funds federally, usually passed through state DOTs. Our RPO network is state operated. So we utilize federal funds to support it, but it is a state mandated network. The federal designation is something called an RTPO, which is a Rural Transportation Planning Organization. And RTPO gets no money and has to do everything an MPO does. Not exactly the greatest situation there. But
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Laria.
Thanks for your presentation. Who does not like this? Who's unhappy? You've described a world in which everybody is happy and you're doing great. And seriously, congratulations.
Thank
but
you.
what are the weak parts? What are the areas where you would want to improve? Et cetera?
Right.
Oh, come on.
No. I'm trying to. So we do have some areas where our system doesn't work very well. One is the replacement of bridges, particularly large bridges. We have a bridge replacement program. This works well for our typical bridges. It does not work well for our large bridges, right? We are a wet state for most of our state. We have large bridges. The cost of replacing an existing bridge with the same capacity, right? A 2-lane bridge with a 2-lane bridge is very high. But that lack of capacity improvement means it doesn't score very well within our system. So that's one area where I think our system falls down. The grants through IIJA and some of the transportation bills of late have helped, but it doesn't fully address that need. Who's unhappy? If you look at the criteria that are enumerated within our highway, they are very single occupancy vehicle focused. So the folks that are unhappy are those that are trying to move us away from that focus on single occupancy vehicles. I think that's where I'm going to stop with that one. Right.
So feel free to continue, but, and if not here, then, you know, a little more discreetly if necessary, because I think it would be, it's just useful to know, I think, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, if we said, we will buy that product, just deliver it on Tuesday, right? It would be good to know like what, you know, but like for you to say, well, hang on, like you should know before you buy the product, there are these kinds of issues that you might want to be thinking about.
Yeah, I think in general, a way to think about it is what you don't see within our system are things like greenhouse gas reductions or throughput of persons as opposed to throughput of vehicles. And so our partners and our groups that are most focused on those prior or policy outcomes, they are less than enthused with our system. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Commissioner Henninger, you have the last bite at the apple, and I also want to be mindful that I appreciate all of Brian has brought to the table, and I appreciate you being willing to continue these conversations offline, but I also want to make sure we give Holly the opportunity to address the commission as well.
Yes,
So
I am originally from Illinois, so it would be, I would get guff from my family. Took up all the time.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the presentation. It is a very beautifully designed system. I do ache for the transit advocates of the state of North Carolina. But there are a few other differences to note. Obviously, the ownership of roads almost completely statewide is very impressive and very different. The almost single mode focus here on highways and like you said, on you know, single occupancy or small occupancy vehicles. Those are kind of two of the biggest ones, in addition to non-highway funding constraints. Also want to point out, you know, the lack of ability for transformative investments in corridors or even in airports from NCDOT here, which means that you know, projects like the Purple Line or even potentially even like the expansion of I-95 coming out of the city of Baltimore into now Harford County probably would never have happened under this kind of protocol.
We have funded some very large highway projects, transformative ones. The I-26 project in Asheville, not Asheboro. Asheville is a $1.5 billion project that went through our system. We have a widening of I-85 in Gastonia, which is just west of Charlotte, which is another $1 billion project that went through our system just fine. The work group has struggled and found a way to try and allow for those transformative non-highway projects to occur. There are limits on the eligibility of those non-highway projects and statewide mobility that are built into the legislation. Again, I think that's a fair question for Maryland to decide if that's something that they wanted to enact as well. But what we do is our non-highway competition at the regional impact is actually a statewide competition. And that was done specifically so that some of those transformative projects would get a chance to operate, right? And that has been very helpful for our rail network, really allowing for some transformative projects there. It's also been helpful for BRT projects. Wake County and Raleigh, and then the DCHC Durham area have been very successful with getting some very large scale BRT projects in. I won't say it's easy, right? Those transformative projects are difficult, but I wouldn't say it's impossible. It is also something that our work group is looking at. Really what we're trying to address on that is less on the transformative and more on the network based. Our system is very point specific, right? You have a need here, so the solution needs to be here, and we're going to measure that. But our network is growing. We're not as dense or as urbanized as I would say as Baltimore is, but we are moving in that direction. And so we need to start looking at different types of solutions, right? To fix a solution in location A, we need to do something in location B. So we're trying to look into ways to do that. We're constantly looking for more and better research data and methodologies to bring in transformative elements of non-highway projects within the highway projects. We have a complete streets policy within our state. And so while there are a lot of highway projects, most of them have non-highway elements. But trying to, again, get there, it can be difficult for those transformative projects. Any sort of prioritization process tends to reward low-cost projects. So this is where our statewide tier actually helps quite a bit. That is a location where those truly transformative projects can compete. They're not necessarily stealing from their neighbor to get that. They're also not requiring that those local needs go unmet to meet that. Actually, the Asheville project, one of the things that held that up under our old system is because it was so expensive and because the funds were distributed into the 14 divisions, it was going to eat up most of the funds for that division. But once that statewide pot of money came on board, it was now, free and clear, provided it scored well enough to go through the system and get funded. So there are ways to get the transformative projects in, but I think it is safe to say that our non-highway transformative projects are a little bit more difficult to get funded. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, very welcome.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate us being the first venture outside of the state of North Carolina. So thank you very much for joining us in person. We are going to shift gears to a hybrid setup, so it may take us a moment to flip that switch, but look forward to the next presentation from our friends in Illinois. So thank you. Holly, can you hear us?
I can. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's been a real pleasure listening to the discussion and the excellent and thoughtfulness of all the comments and presentations today. I'm happy to be here to talk about Illinois' process. A little about me. I've been right now I am the director of the Office of Planning and Programming at the Illinois Department of Transportation. I have been in this role for 3 years. I have been with the department for about 7.5 years, mainly in planning. Prior to moving over to the department, I worked at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, which is the MPO in Northeast Illinois, the Chicago MPO. My entire career has been dedicated to the planning and programming of projects, specifically using data to make these decisions. So I'm happy to be here and happy to provide any insights I may have. So in Illinois, on page 68 of the PDF, there's a lot of information here. What I'm really trying to highlight here is that we are extremely multimodal. We have all 6 now Class 1 railroads through running through Illinois, and in Chicago specifically. We have 1,118 navigable waterways. We also, as a fun fact of talking about bi-state MPOs, we have 5 bi-state MPOs in Illinois, and that is the most in the nation. One thing that I'd really like to take away from here is that in Illinois, we have the most units of local government than any other state in the nation. And that is second to Texas, who has 16 million more people than us. So per capita, we aren't the highest, but in general, we have in Northeast Illinois, in the Chicago region alone, there are 284 municipalities. So we have a lot of local jurisdictions within the state of Illinois. So in Illinois, our transportation funding is from, I would say, probably very traditional revenue sources, including a motor fuel tax, motor vehicle registration fees, and then federal funding. We did have a major capital bill that doubled our motor fuel tax rate and indexed it to inflation, and then also increased our motor vehicle registration rate, along with moving a portion of the sales tax that is collected on the sale of motor fuel to our road and construction fund. The majority of these funds are allocated towards system maintenance projects. We do not have a set amount anywhere that goes to specifically to system maintenance or to capacity improvements. But generally through our programming process, about 67 to 70% of our funds, our highway funds, do go to maintenance projects. The remaining funds we can be allocated towards capacity changing projects or even modernization, which isn't necessarily capacity, like upgrading traffic signals. It is a very small portion of our program that goes to actual capacity projects. So I believe it was 2021, we had what we call House Bill 253 was passed. This was passed, this was passed after that major capital bill. What it does is it has three components, I like to say. It has, the first is it solidifies FHWA's asset management or MAP 21's asset management requirements for our highway assets. So that's our roads and bridges. And then it does the same for transit. It requires IDOT to use data to prioritize capacity changing projects on our state-owned system. So that's key there. So on our state-owned system, and then it also requires the Regional Transportation Authority, which is the three service boards we have in Northeast Illinois: CTA, Metra, and PACE. They have an agency called the Regional Transportation Authority that oversees all of them, and it requires the RTA to also make a performance-based project selection process for their new capacity projects. We have very limited input into the projects that our transit agencies do select. So during the legislation, it was, we were asked our thoughts on it, and gave some thoughts. Personally, my feeling was that we wanted to really, because of the changing dynamics and having been in this realm for a while, you can see that the priorities change. And so we didn't think it was a good idea to put specific criteria into the legislation. The initial legislation did outline about 6 criteria. I thought it was better, because we do long-range planning efforts every 5 years, that we tie it to our long-range plan, because there's also significant public input into our long-range transportation plan. So that was one of the thoughts that was taken into consideration, and it was changed to reference the long-range transportation plan. However, two specific criteria were included, and those were equity and emissions, and I'll talk about those a little later. There was some questions about how do we identify existing projects. There are some questions about what do we do with existing projects. So let's say we had already done NEPA and a little bit of design for a big highway expansion. Does that project now maybe not move forward? And so those projects, there was some language within the legislation that indicated if a project had already received funding in a previous program, then it would move forward without having to go through the data-driven decisions tool. Regional priorities was a big one. There was a lot of talk about, in Illinois, we have the Chicago region, which has the city itself, and then suburbs. We have a very big rural population. We are very diverse geographically. And the thought was that, in the Chicago region, we're going to hear a lot about congestion being a priority. We need to relieve congestion. And in the rest of Illinois, downstate, that we thought we would hear a lot about economic development. That economic development needed road capacity projects in order to entice that economic development. So that was a consideration. And within the legislation, it indicated that the department could prioritize its criteria differently based on where the project is located. And then the last one was project identification. There was written into the legislation a suggestion that we would have essentially like a form on our website that people would be allowed to submit projects to. And so that was removed as we have some relationships already with a lot of our locals in order to identify potential projects they'd like on the state system. So that was also revised. So how we developed the tool was essentially from our long range transportation plan. And then also, as Matt referenced, the federal performance management was a big component as well from MAP 21. We had also for many years had been hearing from our MPOs and our advocacy organizations that we aren't being transparent in how we're identifying how we select projects. And so we took that to heart too in a number of their suggestions in how we developed a tool. We had also developed a prioritization tool about 3 years prior to this, but it was not working well within our existing system. We had hired a consultant out to do it for us. And when it came time to integrate into our legacy systems, it didn't work well. And so we used what we learned from that tool to work to develop the tool that we have now. So for how, as I mentioned, we used our long range transportation plan as our guiding document and looked at the main goals of that. And I always like to point out here that safety is not one of these called out goals. And it's not because it's not important, it's because it's the most important. We have safety considerations in all 5 of these goals, along with metrics and a number of other considerations. So our tool ended up having these 5 overarching goals and then criteria, which I think we have 13 evaluation criteria within them. It was very important for us to be very specific in what criteria or what the criteria was going to be, because we had received a lot of feedback through informal channels that maybe some criteria, some data source that we had isn't the best. And so it was very important for us to outline what that was. And we did take some from the MAP 21 transportation performance management requirements that we have. So you can see here that we have under environmental impacts, livability, equity, and emissions. We did have one criteria related to environmental justice, which is percentage of low income and percentage of minority population combined, and it's defined by our Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. And so what we do there is essentially you get extra points if your project is within that location. Now, based on some of the comments, I wanted to highlight this because we don't feel that works very well. Because we're building a project in a certain environmental justice area does not mean it's benefiting those populations. So that's something that we've been working on. So for implementation, so the legislation passed and thankfully we had already been working on a tool. So we had already pretty much had a tool ready to put out for public comment. We wanted to make sure we did public comment because we wanted to receive this feedback. There are still a lot of local jurisdiction advocacy groups, industry, businesses who are interested in how this tool works. So the first thing we did is we put out a webinar. We essentially got branding done, as you can see from the nice slides. We had some branding done. We brought on a consultant. It was about, I think it was under $100,000 to bring on a consultant to help us to do these things. And we had some branding done. We developed a fact sheet. We developed some documentation of how the tool works. And then we also developed what's called a MetroQuest survey. I'm not sure how you all are familiar with that. And we went out and we sent it to our Illinois Municipal League, our Illinois Association of Counties, our Illinois Association of Regional Councils, all of our industry partners, all of our labor partners. And we sent this essentially to the main organizations and asked them to distribute it to their members. and make sure everyone was aware of it. We did a webinar, so there wasn't limitation in driving, from Carbondale to Chicago. We made sure everyone could attend. And then I gave a presentation similar just to how the tool works. So after that, we left it open for public comment and we sent out a MetroQuest survey. And in this MetroQuest survey, we said, here's our 5 goals. Here's the criteria within these goals. If you have $1 to spend, what would you spend it on? So we were trying to get their understanding of which is most important to them for how we spend the funding. So documentation, like I said, we put everything on the website. I'll get into that a little more, but I wanted to make sure that we put as much out there as we possibly could. Identification of projects, we did this through our districts. We have 9 districts within the state of Illinois. And it was during our traditional program development process where we reach out to them and we say, what projects do you plan to do? And we gave them essentially a form that asked a bunch of questions related to the project. And we used that to inform the tool. We did an analysis of the projects. And then again, I put on, it's so important, documentation. So for projects, we received 34 projects that we evaluated. This was also the first program after IIJA or BIL was passed because the bipartisan infrastructure law, which, identified some increased federal resources for us. And so one of our kind of guiding principles as we sent it out was we do not have a lot of projects started through the NEPA process. And so we're looking to maybe start a couple NEPA processes on some major projects that we hadn't been able to do given our funding situation before Rebuild Illinois or the bipartisan infrastructure law. We received 34 projects. It was tough for us to evaluate the projects based on the different phases of project development. Like I mentioned, we were trying to focus on phase 1 engineering, what we call phase 1 engineering, which is the NEPA process. It was also one of the main things was the cost benefit. If you can see on this slide here on page 76, this is the spreadsheet. It is out on our website. With every single piece of data that was related to the projects and what we used to determine how to move, which projects we were going to move forward. So as I mentioned, in relaying everything, we wanted to share it all. We wanted to share every piece of information we had. We wanted people to be able to recreate this process if they desired. And so we had a document with each criteria showing a link to where we have the data available, how we did the calculations with formulas, and then how it calculated into the total score. So for each criteria, we had that to make sure that people were completely clear on the information that we were using to make these decisions. One thing that we came upon was that when it came to looking at this, the highest scored project down to until, funding was exhausted, or maybe there was, a place where it made sense to quit funding projects in the scores, maybe didn't make sense for a number of reasons that we could not quantify, such as project readiness, or maybe there's some opposition, or another big one in Illinois is geographic equity. So we had this memo drafted explaining that, we evaluated these 34 projects. We selected 13 to move forward for inclusion in our program. But these were not top down for a number of reasons that we could not quantify, but some of them are listed here. And then again, a key component was that transparency. It was so important to be able to share that information. And because of that, I'd say we didn't receive very significant feedback after the projects were released. So another thing that we did was we completed a lessons learned document because there was a number of lessons that we did learn. We knew some of these going into it, but I thought it was important that we document what lessons we did learn, and kind of, it's a lessons learned, but it's also like what we're doing to move forward, right? So I mentioned that prioritization process we did with the MetroQuest survey. We were very surprised that there was not a big discrepancy between downstate and Northeast Illinois. The economic development and the congestion relief scored about the same throughout the state, and so that was something we were surprised to hear, or surprised to see. What did surprise us was that our livability criteria scored about equal with those, and so I don't think we were necessarily expecting that. When we came out and looked at the scores and looked at the cost of the projects, we noted, and the type of the project. So we have 2-lane rural not expressways, highways down in Southern Illinois that need a center left turn lane. We have the Dan Ryan that needs to be reconstructed, or I-290 up in the Chicago region. And so those are like massively different types of projects in different parts of the state, because the economy in Northeast Illinois is significantly different than the economy in Southern Illinois. And so when we were comparing, the Dan Ryan project that's on our list to, a 2-lane highway down in Carbondale, it was difficult to do a cost benefit analysis because those projects are so different and their costs so different. And so one of the lessons learned was maybe we do it not necessarily by geographic boundary, but by project type. Like, is it an expressway? Is it just, a state highway? What kind of facility is it? Same with the geographic locations. The regional considerations, we do not have that figured out. So that was a big lesson learned. We allowed our district to essentially identify bonus points, is a simplified way of saying it. And we essentially assumed that was the regional prioritization of them, and that they have spoken with our local agencies. Again, this is just state-sponsored projects, and so no local projects were included in this, but there's still obviously an interest from local entities on the state system. Another was internal communication. While we sent those lists out, we sent the form out to the district to submit projects on. There was little follow-up to that. And I think there was also some confusion about what kind of projects they should be putting on here and what information should be included. And so that was something we needed to do better as well. So our advocacy groups we have a number within the state of Illinois, and they're very interested in this. And of course, they're looking for how we can compare highway projects to transit projects, and among other different modes, but mainly transit projects. And in Illinois, those are two separate jurisdictional. They have two separate jurisdictional control. Illinois does not operate any transit facilities. And so we've been meeting with them to explain that and explain our processes, but we continue to have that conversation, and we will continue to have it. We've been writing letters back and forth, and those are on our website as well, just to show, again, full transparency. But we also have regular meetings where we're talking, and it's been going very well. The other is our updated metrics for equity. I mentioned that, just because a project is in an environmental justice area doesn't mean it's benefiting those populations that live there. And so we have been working on developing an equity measure, looking at the users of the facility and how the changes we're making will benefit them. This requires some data that we have been in the process of procuring for well over a year. As mentioned by Brian, we can only do what we can do with the data we have. And so we have been working on developing that, but unfortunately, it's been taking a while. Emissions is an example of a criteria that maybe it's an example of having specific criteria called out within the legislation. So electric vehicles are coming, and if we do an emission calculation using our travel demand model with the fleet change into electric vehicles, our emissions are going to go down no matter what we do. And so it's, maybe that isn't the right measure. We have generally used emissions as complementary to how many cars are driving on the facility, right? So looking at induced demand, if we do expand the system, more cars are going to drive on it, and therefore emissions will go up. But with electric vehicles, that may not be the case because there are no emissions from electric vehicles. So that's something we're working through, we're trying to. And then also we have to update our regional coordination and find a better process for that. We do not have rural planning organizations, although that would be something that I would find extremely beneficial within this process, and essentially our planning and programming process as a whole. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I know we got a little bit of a late start, but I do want to be mindful of folks' time. But if we have questions from the commissioners for Holly. None, seeing none. Thank you, Holly. We really appreciate you sharing that. And I'm sure we will be circling back with you with any additional questions that we have. So appreciate your spending time with us and sharing the insights from the wonderful state of Illinois. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Well, just some quick housekeeping items. And again, sorry for going over in time. I know we did start a little late. We do have our next meeting scheduled for November 6th at 1 o'clock. And I think during that, we expect to go through a broad brush of topics at that meeting. The next following meeting was for December 13th at 1 o'clock. And I think that the commissioners should be prepared to discuss what we've learned, themes, and any recommendations that we're preparing to make or, put into an interim report. So that's coming rapidly upon us. I think feels like it's happening rather quickly. We do have some of the follow-up items that we had discussed earlier on and expect to have those back to the commissioners later this week. And I will remind folks, I don't think I need to remind, it's a 2-year little journey that we're on. So I think we're going to have some work ahead of us, and we'll have to have patience to sort of get through all of the various topics that I think we all want to get onto the table for the conversation, and helping with both the department and with the administration, along with, our legislative leaders. So I just, sort of offer that as a thought as well. Commissioner Tolkien.
Thank you. Could you repeat what you said about the recommendations? Did you say that? I didn't catch.
If we're going to make recommendations in the interim report, again, that's a question mark. Okay. I think, right now we're sort of going through a lot of the various topics that have been outlined in terms of the charge of the commission. And I think the question will be is what will be the breadth and depth of anything that we provide as an interim report to the department and to the legislature.
I would, I think it's a really good conversation. I also would ask that if that is a direction that we're going in, that there be a very explicit solicitation for suggestions from the commission members with enough time to, at least for those of us who are representatives of other groups, prepare something written in advance.
Okay.
And even if we just want to cover ourselves, if we want to solicit that in advance of the next meeting. So if people have recommendations that could bring it in, that way, at least, we're not losing another month, because I guess we only have 2.
Gotcha. Yep.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.